Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 258 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on April 1st, 2023. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, we are going to, of course, discuss the news from the last couple of weeks. And there actually is some very, very interesting news, important news, so we'll get to that. And then later on in the show, we have 3 episode reviews as we continue our Avatar and Korra rewatches. So on the Avatar side of things, we're going to be doing 202, The Cave of Two Lovers. And for Korra, we're going to be doing 2 episodes, Civil Wars Part 1 and Civil Wars Part 2 from Legend of Korra Book 2 Spirits. So that's what we're covering today. And we'll get straight into the news. So the first one is a pretty notable one, got people very, very excited. And that was that we got our first official piece of art for the character Princess Zaysan from the Avatar Legends role-playing game. So where this came from is that if you are a Kickstarter backer, earlier on this month, you got, or last month, you got access to the All-Star Play videos at last. So they are exclusive for now, but they will go out publicly to everyone. And the story they're playing in that is a Roku era story that includes Princess Zaysan. And so at the start of it, they give you a little kind of Avatar intro to the Roku era, and they show the shot of Princess Zaysan. Now, afterwards, Alexandria Monique came out and said that, hey, I designed this character, and she actually got permission to show off some of the concept art that eventually got the character from their initial design to the finalized design that we have here. So it's one official piece of art and then a bunch of other sort of like concept art stuff that I'm not sure how much there is necessarily to read into. I don't think we exactly know, I suppose, where this image is going to be found. I'm guessing once we get the adventure booklet for An Urgent Request, which is the All-Star Play adventure, this image will be in there. Otherwise, I'm not exactly sure what the details are. But Greg, what are your thoughts on the Princess Zaysan design?
I think the design is great. I think it works really well. It was really cool to see how they used it in the video, and that we get to actually see some of the actual like concept designs and stuff that they used to actually get to the final design that we see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the main thing with the concept stuff is just initially the plan was basically go off Azula, and so the first concept art to me looks like middle-aged Azula, almost like exactly that. Like that is what Azula would look like in her like 30s or whatever. So it's interesting that the evolution like completely changes the design of the character. Not particularly look like Azula, apart from maybe like hair color. So that's really good, and of course blending the whole. She's a Fire Nation princess, but also follows air nomad ideals together is actually pretty nice as a way that it's mostly Fire Nation, but with a touch of kind of airbender, which is kind of nice. But yeah, hopefully we get to see more of this as we go on. Alexandria Monique is an important artist on like the upcoming stuff, so who knows, maybe we'll get to see more character designs for characters that we haven't seen anything. But we'll continue with Avatar Legends. So the most recent Kickstarter update, in addition to giving backers the All-Star Play videos, also finally did a bit of a coming soon on the upcoming Republic City book. So we've known that this has been coming for a while. We've seen bits and pieces of the art, but they showed off basically a mock-up of the cover here. I'm guessing it is the finalized cover. So the book is actually a Republic City Setting Toolkit. That's what they're calling it here. The description says, you'll find a treasure trove of details on the capital city of United Republic, descriptions of its many districts with attached plot hooks and characters, fill the book's pages. It's the perfect tool for those who love the setting and for those who want to set their games in Republic City's endless possibilities. What's more, there are write-ups of 5 legendary NPCs who play roles of special importance in Republic City, including Mako and Bolin. The book also provides mechanics for Republic City features like pro-bending, vehicles, and mecha, as well as 3 whole new playbooks for use in any setting, and a suite of new techniques. There's also an adventure that is set in Republic City, all about underground tunnel racing. So that's interesting. And they also tease this. Pre-orders will begin this spring, along with a special surprise. We'll let you know when it launches by posting an update here. So, I guess this confirms to us at the very least there will be some sort of a kind of lore information section at the start of this book. 5 legend NPCs, Mako and Bolin are 2 of them, and I would guess based on the description they have to be Korra era characters to fill in the other slots. So the likes of Kaya, Janora, General Iroh, I guess will be kind of candidates for the other slots. But what are your thoughts on this book, the cover here, and some of the details we now have about it?
Yeah, I think the cover looks really cool. I think it, does a good job of capturing what happened during Korra's time there, at least in the beginning in Republic City. So that turned out pretty cool. But yeah, I think the idea of what they have or, their setup for this sounds pretty cool. I mean, it, pretty much seems like it's going to play out just like the other ones, which I think is really good. So it should be fun times for people who want to follow stories in Republic Cities, which I know many people do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just hope when they describe the districts that we get a detailed map of Republic City. Because I do feel the map in the core book could have been a little bit more detailed to fill in more of the map. But hopefully this is good. We were pro bending. Also, I hope we get more on the teams and stuff like that. But it should be pretty exciting. And then any thoughts on what this special surprise is going to be along with the pre-order?
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if it's going to be like a discount thing or if they're actually going to try to add some additional stuff or whatever. I don't know how much they want to go into that with everything that's happened before.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of wonder, will they put this up for pre-order but then announce the Spirit World book, or will they announce that they're actually beginning work on more content after the initial books? Because I think overall it's been a huge success. So are we just going to be done after the Spirit World book, which I assume will be late this year? That's something I'd like to know, because we're getting to the point now where they could absolutely do a book about the Yangchen era if they wanted to. There's a lot of other stuff that they probably could do to add into this. Similarly, Wan's era, ancient Avatar would be a cool era to get. So there's options with this sort of stuff. I'm not really sure. It's a weird one in that is it just that there's going to be a pre-order bonus where if you pre-order it within the first however long, you get the book and something else, I don't know, special dice or something like that. Who knows what they could do? But I guess they're trying to make it a little bit more of an interesting thing and not just the product is now available for purchase. So we'll see what happens there. They actually replied to one of my comments. I asked them about an urgent request, and they said the next update will have information on when we're going to get it. So I guess the April update, which is probably still 2 weeks away, will tell us some details on more of this stuff. Because we're getting to the point now where we're basically in spring now, so the pre-order should be going up any time now. That then brings us into probably the most significant news that has happened since the last podcast. And that is, at long last, they have announced Chronicles of the Avatar Book 4, Yangchen Book 2. It's coming July 18th, and the title is The Legacy of Yangchen. So this all got revealed over the course of 2 days. Very exciting times. So we have the cover here along with some other kind of extra stuff. So we get, of course, the standard hardcover. We got the Barnes & Noble's hardcover exclusive edition, which it seems like it's not going to be as significant as other times. It just seems like it's an interview with FCE that goes into the creative process of the novels. So they're not really teasing exclusive art or deleted scenes. So we'll see what happens with that. And then one of the more interesting ones was with this announced Avatar The Last Airbender, the Kyoshi novels and the Yangchen novels, Chronicles of the Avatar Box Set 2, which is a box set of all 4 so far Chronicles of the Avatar books together in one. So they didn't do a Yangchen 2-book box set, they did a 4-book complete series box set, which has upset a few people, but it's an interesting one. We'll get to discussing it. So before we get into like the description and so on, just what are your thoughts kind of surrounding the announcement? It's finally here and exactly when expected with the release.
Yeah, that is true, isn't it? But yeah, no, I think it's pretty cool. I mean, it's really excited when I heard this being announced and everyone else sort of going into, it coming out and seeing the cover for the first time. So no, I think this is great. It's definitely something that we've been waiting for quite a bit now, I think.
And yeah, the cover, as you mentioned there, is pretty nice. They have a purple color scheme this time out. Um, we have Yangchen on the cover. We also have Kavik on the cover, so they continue the trend of like each avatar's like first book is them on their own, but then the second book features their like main companion. But also Northern Air Temple in the background as well, which is a very significant location based on like the first book because that's where Unanimity, the combustion benders, are being held, and it, by the looks of the description, it's where at least some of the big action in the book is going to take place. So that's pretty exciting overall. So there's that. As for the box set, yeah, people are a little upset because a lot people like to buy collections of books. We've seen this over the years with comics. A lot of people wait for the hardcovers. With the Kyoshi books, people like that they offered the two Kyoshi books as a box set. So it is a little bit frustrating that they're kind of asking people to kind of double dip or sometimes triple dip depending on how many books you actually have. And it does have a bonus poster. The poster says it has character illustrations on it. We don't know what exactly that means, but I would assume it might be just all of the exclusive content from the previous books, all those pieces of art just on a big poster. I'd like to see how exactly that's like laid out, or is it like new art? I'm not really sure what to make of it because the box is just utilizing the cover art. There's nothing new for the most part outside of it's designed as a box. But what are your thoughts on this decision to go for the 4-book box set rather than a Yangchen 2-book set?
It does seem a bit odd. I mean, I would think that they would do both if they have, the means to do so that, people don't have to like double dip like you're saying there. So I don't know. It does seem a bit odd. I wonder if that's, sort of placeholder for now, the way they have it set up now, or maybe that is fine. I'm not really sure. But yeah, it does seem a bit odd considering what they've done in the past, at least.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I can think of is that the first box set came out like literally just before they announced the title as being Chronicles of the Avatar, which is why like all my editions of the books, none of the Kyoshi ones say Chronicles of the Avatar on it. Even the box set versions, it doesn't say that. It's just they're called the Kyoshi novels. That's what the the duo is. So I understand from the perspective of like they're probably looking to get as many new people in, and they're probably considering that new people getting into the novels would probably prefer to get them all at once, and they'll get collectors buying it as well. So from a business perspective, perhaps this is maybe the more ideal way to do it, because it's a $80 box. I assume it will be cheaper from certain places, so I could see this maybe getting down to maybe being closer to around 60 when you actually come to pre-order it, hopefully. But yeah, this is it's in October, so they're not waiting too long to release this after the 4th Yangchen book, so the 4th Chronicles of the Avatar book, so that's an interesting one. But yeah, let's get back to the description, which we do have here. So here's what it says. Common enemies make for strange friends. Avatar Yangchen has succeeded in bringing a measure of stability to Bin-Er, but her successes have been limited to a single city. And rumors concerning Unanimity, a weapon capable of total obliteration, have led to increasing tensions among the 4 nations. Desperate to restore diplomacy, Yangchen attempts to de-escalate hostilities between heads of state, but in the wake of a brutal assassination and the freeing of Unanimity, Yangchen is forced to bring Kavik, the trusted former companion whose betrayal crushed her, back into the fold. As the 4 nations teeter on the brink of conflict and she begins to unravel the power-hungry Zongdu Chaisi's true agenda, Yangchen is forced to measure the worth of humanity and how much can be sacrificed in the name of balance. This taut and provocative 4th installment in the Chronicles of the Avatar series follows Avatar Yangchen as she charts the course of her legacy, finally making peace with her choices and facing Avatarhood with the courage it demands. So a lot going on here because much more so
Hmm.
than Rise of Kyoshi going into Shadow of Kyoshi, like the first book is set up for this book in so many ways. So they're struggling to not spoil, I suppose, the kind of big mysteries from the end of the first book here. Um, but there's a lot that gets talked about here. I think a lot of the discussion immediately has been about, okay, who gets assassinated and how does unanimity get freed. People are excited to see Yangchen and Kavik meet up again to see how exactly that goes, given that he's now part of the Order of the White Lotus and how that's all gone down for him. Chicey, of course, we're waiting to see so much about what exactly she's up to. Um, the reveal about like what exactly the combustion bending kind of manufacture process, quote unquote, is. Um, there's a lot going on here, but what are your thoughts on the description?
Yeah, it does really feel like there's a lot going on. I mean, I wonder, I mean, I'm sure they figured out a way to do it, but it almost feels like maybe it's too much for this book. But yeah, no, I'm definitely really curious about it. I mean, I think, the whole idea of how they're trying to hold back, I guess, in the description of saying exactly what everything is kind of funny considering. But I don't know, I think, the idea that, there's different tensions with the nations and that, we have like all these different powers in play and, obviously we know their relationship with Kavik has to, somehow become at least a little bit more stabilized. So no, there's a lot going on. It's really sounds really cool.
hmm And this is without even mentioning the fact that like Kavik's brother Kalyan is still out there, which we assume will get some sort of resolution. Uh, they've set up the whole Yang Chen, how will she free Jetson from the spirit world situation as well. So there's even more than is directly mentioned here as well. But
Mhm.
yeah, like I said, most of the speculation I think has been about the assassination in terms of like wait, who gets assassinated? Are these two things like related to each other? Is it like an assassination that also frees unanimity, or is just someone separate from like the Northern Air Temple assassinated, and then also unanimity is freed? Because if they're connected, I'd be thinking like, does Zongdu Hansha get assassinated just so he
Mm.
doesn't speak and the others get freed? Or are we talking like the head of the Northern Air Temple gets assassinated? Or is it one of the heads of state? Because so some people are saying like, what if Earth King Faishan gets assassinated, and what if this is how you bring um, Tiegwai the Immortal kind of into things, Lao Ge into things? It's like, what if this is that Earth King that he was said to have assassinated? That'd be pretty crazy because Faishan was like a huge setup from the first book. But do you have any thoughts on this assassination?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's so many options that they have for, unfortunately, who could get assassinated and how that could like affect things from like any of the heads of states or any of the Zongdus. I mean, it could even be, I don't know. I mean, and with, it or, with unanimity being, a thing with the multiple, benders that they have for that, like, I don't know, it could even be, one of them that could set things off as well. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of options.
And then if it is separate, like how is unanimity freed? Because they seem to have constant surveillance from like a bunch of airbenders. Um, I'm not sure because like they obviously technically would have the power to do it themselves. As many have brought up, like they're theoretically the timeline could work out where like a Sozin's comet could actually kind of happen again, or just the comet, at this point.
Hmm.
But I'd almost be like, well, there's probably more combustion benders out there. That's one way to free other combustion benders, introduce more of them. But who really knows? And then obviously there's little details like don't, especially going into like the second book, how much time is going to pass between the books. Remember that Zongdu Chaisi was said to be like, what was it, like 7 months pregnant, I think. So we're waiting to see like if that's like a plot point, like her having a child and what that means for her as such. But so I like that she's being directly kind of alluded to here as basically being like the main kind of antagonist of the book, which is pretty good. But yeah, we don't have too long to wait for this. This is the good thing about this kind of announcement, is that we all predicted that like, yeah, it's probably going to get announced end of March for a July release. That's exactly how it's worked out. We should be getting, I guess, our first excerpt, first preview chapter, probably sometime in May, audiobook preview sometime in June, and then the book is out in July. So not too long to wait. That's going to be pretty exciting. And then, of course, hopefully there's something at San Diego Comic-Con in or around that time as well. So exciting that that's finally out, because it's like now we know for sure. Yangchen Book 2 plus the Azula comic alone is kind of going to make the year. Better than a lot of previous years that we've had. So, last piece of news, it's sort of a combination of news topics here, but sort of this month's batch of Avatar Studios rumors. I don't think they're as big as they were in previous months, but there's some interesting stuff. So the first one here is that the Kyoshi characters from The Rise of Kyoshi, Shadow of Kyoshi, apparently are going to have substantial roles in a project that is maybe coming out in 2025. Now, this one gets added to much later on in the month with information that apparently there's this show, Avatar New Generations is a new title for something, and that this is the show that the Kyoshi characters are actually going to have sizable roles in. But what's not clear is if New Generations is just the name of the 2025 series, the Earth Avatar After Korra series, or something else. So this speaks to, I suppose, the kind of scattered information that we're dealing with. Because all of this is coming from like casting information. Right now they are casting for Team Avatar for the adult gang movie, and they're seemingly casting the Kyoshi cast as well at the same time. So that's where the whole Kyoshi stuff in one of the early projects, and now we have another potential title. It's getting a bit confusing at this point. I appreciate like Avatar News trying to link everything together, but I think a lot of people are now like, wait, what's going on here? So is Kyoshi going to be flashbacks in the movie, or some sort of an anthology series? Is that what the New Generations title refers to? I'm at this point pretty confused about like how many projects there are. I wish they'd like officially announce something, because that's probably the big thing, is that we're probably getting to the point where they're going to have to announce the 2025 series officially soon. So hopefully some of this stuff gets confirmed, especially if casting is going on right now. But what are your thoughts on this kind of recent batch of rumors kind of focused on Kyoshi character casting?
Yeah, I don't know what to quite think of it. I mean, I think, obviously we know the popularity of the characters in the books and everything like that. So, it doesn't surprise me that they would be, in these new projects in some form or capacity, even if it is just flashbacks. Like, I don't know if we're necessarily going to get like, them in like the forefront per se, but, they have enough of a role that they're, in the casting call for things and stuff like that. So it's definitely cool and definitely interesting. But yeah, I definitely can understand how people who might not be following this as much or just see it sort of on the periphery, don't quite have everything sort of in line with how everything goes, which I guess is just sort of unfortunately how sort of rumors go in general, which, to your point of, it would be nice to have something more official, would be nice on that, but doesn't seem like we're still quite at that point yet. I mean, if it does come out in like, the next 2 years, maybe we'll get, information soon, but I don't know, at the rate that we're going now, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not like more officially announced until like maybe like a year before it actually comes out and has like a hard deadline at that point.
Yeah, it's just weird because obviously there are rumors of like an actual Kyoshi project as well, but that seems to be potentially like post 2027, but it was always one of the first projects that was being tossed around. So I don't know, it's confusing because I'm guessing who they cast here will continue into whatever Kyoshi project they have. So they'll cast their Kyoshi, their Rangi, their Heiron, I guess. Yoon, like that's the interesting thing, like the fact that Yoon is mentioned here when like his role in the story is like finished. So if they're telling that story, they're telling the rise and shadow of Kyoshi, or they're telling a story that maybe more focuses specifically on Yoon from like the time when he was thought to be the Avatar. But then that story might not involve Kyoshi that much because of like the whole setup from the books about what their dynamic is. that's kind of weird to me, in that it makes me wonder, like, okay, are they testing the waters, I suppose, with the Kyoshi stuff by putting it into one of the first projects, and then if it fully works, they'll fully confirm a Kyoshi thing at a later point? That's kind of what it feels like to me. But then they also said they weren't really doing adaptations, so uh, I don't really know what to make of it, is the main thing here. The very last thing was just that I think we discussed this on the last podcast, but we got the ages of the characters as Aang and Co are going to be in the adult gang movie. So Aang's going to be 24, Katara's going to be 26, and so on. Avatar News basically, I suppose, revealed where that information like came from, which is like the casting call information for Aang and Co. So there's not too much to say about this. I'll just read out like one or two of them. So Aang, it says here, 24, male, from a fictional community inspired by the monastic cultures of Asia, adventurous, kind, with a youthful exuberance and energy. Aang wants to be everyone's best friend. He prefers to resolve conflicts without violence. Katara is 26, female, from a fictional community inspired by cultures of the First Nations of Canada, Indigenous America, and Inuit people. Independent, passionate, and determined, Katara is a young woman with a huge heart who often puts the needs of others ahead of her own. She believes in the goodness and potential of others, even if they don't believe themselves. And it's pretty similar for Sokka, charismatic, ambitious man, wry sense of humor, natural leader, storyteller, looking to help people, courageous and resourceful. He will fight for what he believes in. So they're the kind of direct casting call information that we have so far. So any thoughts on those descriptions?
No, not particularly. I mean, it sounds like they have the characters figured out for the type of voices that they want, or people who can speak to those voices.
Yeah, and I think in one of his tweets as well, he roughly mentioned the idea that he has word basically that like they have people, like, I suppose, some of the selection process done, so they have people properly in, like, going for these very early in the process. It seems like it's a decent part way through. So I don't know. Hopefully by maybe Comic-Con time this year, they'll have some of this stuff confirmed and they can tell us at least something about it. It feels like we need to get some official information on this sooner rather than later. And especially the first project, it feels like, because it's the characters we know, you should be able to eventually confirm stuff to us a little bit further out. But even just in general, I think they need to be a little clearer about like how many projects are we actually talking about here and all this sort of stuff. So that's that. But yeah, that has been all the news that we have so far. Beyond that, we are just waiting for like other announcements of other sort of like products and stuff like that. The White Schwartz stuff, I don't think the spoilers for the cards are going to happen for at least another few weeks, so we'll see what happens there. But we're going to turn things over now to the reviews, and we're going to start with Avatar. So we're going to start with 202, The Cave of Two Lovers, because it is a little bit more of a kind of simple to the point episode. I don't think we'll be like too long getting through this one, because I think we will have quite a lot to discuss in the Civil Wars two-parter for Korra. So, Cave of Two Lovers, overall, I think it's a very good episode. I think this is sort of a perfect example of like Book 2's like writing improvements over Book 1, where this is like a sort of equivalent episode to like The Fortune Teller, in that like it's a Katang centric episode where Sokka has a bit of a kind of frustrating, kind of skeptical type plot going on, but they add on to it and make it feel more important with the kind of earthbending lore, the introduction of badger moles, and a nice enough small Zuko plot to start off kind of his journey for the season. So I think it's a real example of like improvements for one season over the other. And there's some really just nice writing. It's a really funny episode. Chang and the Nomads are great new characters, and I always love the lore, even if it's there's something to discuss about it as we'll get into. But overall, Greg, what are your thoughts on The Cave of Two Lovers?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a good one. I think the lore of this one definitely helps to build out the world, and even if the story is more, I guess, simple or straightforward. It gives you a good bit of, information on our characters and sort of where they're sort of progressing in their journey. Like, they have a clear goal in mind, but, it's sort of like a sidetrack story, but it still keeps things going. It doesn't like completely derail things, which is, sometimes what happens when you have some of these sort of side episodes. This one at least keeps things going. You get some funny moments. I think, of course, the song in this episode is always a reference in the fandom. So there's a lot of things in this episode that, have stayed around for the test of time.
Hmm. So yeah, let's get into the episode, and I think we'll just start with the Zuko section because like it's the side plot of the episode. It's pretty short. So basically, Iroh inadvertently kind of poisons himself, makes tea out of a poison plant, so he's got like a rash all over the place. So they have to go to some healers. This is where we get introduced to Song and her mother, who of course help to heal Iroh, and basically Zuko has a bit of a one-on-one talk with Song, and effectively it's just she notices he's burned. She shows a firebender scar that she has on her leg, and kind of highlights that someone else who has been scarred, hurt by the Fire Nation, and you can see he has a bit of an emotional reaction to like seeing this Earth Kingdom girl talk to him about being hurt by the Fire Nation and saying it in that same way of like, oh, someone in the Fire Nation burned me, someone in the Fire Nation burned you, and these people who've been very kind to them have suffered at the hands of the Fire Nation. And while ultimately the arc, it's just the start of the arc here, so it has a slight impact on Zuko. It starts the journey. They ultimately leave, and Zuko steals the family's ostrich horse on the way out. But there is that slight doubt. This is the start of that kind of Zuko learning about sort of the strength of the Earth Kingdom, but also how badly affected they've been by the Fire Nation, how the rest of the world views the Fire Nation, and it's just meant to be this kind of Zuko removed from his kind of birthright on the run, gets to see the Fire Nation with kind of like new eyes by interacting with other people. So what are your thoughts on the Zuko side of this episode?
Yeah, no, his interactions here is definitely notable because, like you said, it does really start his, I guess, just general understanding of, other people in the world, how they're being affected by the Fire Nation, how he, is realizing that he's maybe not quite made out for this being on the run sort of lifestyle, which is sort of how they open up this one with him and his character. But yeah, you definitely, like you say, you can get to see that he really is, starting to see, the similarities that he has with other people who've been affected by this war, and he, he's actually supposed to be like, directly part of this war, in theory, his whole family supporting it, right? So he's, trying to grapple with that sort of idea here while also, having been affected by it, directly in some painful ways as well, even though, it's something that he, up until this point was really trying to support. So no, it is really, interesting to see Zuko start on this journey. Like you said, he's not really, he doesn't really understand it fully yet, but you can definitely see that he's starting to understand the concept of how people are, sort of being affected by this war that his family's been involved with for a while.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, when Song mentions that, like, there is hope, the Avatar has returned, and Zuko's like, I know. That's where you can really tell that, like, okay, this has not fully changed him just yet, because the mention of Aang just to be like, oh yeah, that's my mission, that's what I have to do. He still hasn't come to reflect on that in the full way that he will over the course of the book. So we can now focus on the kind of core of the episode here, going into the tunnels. And so it basically starts with the group meeting Chong and nomads, of course. And so we get their songs, the very humorous characterization here of all of them that immediately starts to frustrate Sokka, but Katara and Aang are for the most part like, okay, this is just how they are, but it does begin to frustrate Sokka quite heavily. These are really, really memorable kind of one-off characters. Of course, we have seen Chong and the Nomads again in Toph Beifong's Metal Bending Academy, which was a nice kind of return for the characters. But this is just like, you remember moments like these with these characters. The songs obviously makes them memorable, but even just the characterization of like Chong is just so he's just so the way he is, the repetition of things of just like Aang being like, I'm also a nomad, me too, and Aang's just like, yeah, I said that. But what are your thoughts on Chong and the nomads in the...
Yeah, I mean, I think they're fun characters, but they definitely don't have, like you would say, like the staying power of other sort of minor characters that we've had throughout the series. Like even the ones that probably say like a lot less than these ones actually do. But you do remember their song and sort of the whole idea. So it shows you that sort of like the core of the episode and sort of the idea and the traveling and that sort of stuff, definitely sticks around. But, the characters themselves, even if they are kind of funny, they have sort of this, airiness to them, sort of that whole sort of like 70s go with the flow type of feel that they're trying to sort of imitate here. Them themselves don't really stand out that much. Like I definitely forget, the third nomad that's actually named here's names every once in a while. So they definitely don't have that sort of staying power, but they are fun characters. They do, give Sokka enough to sort of play off of, which they're just a complete contrast to him and sort of his personality. So they do that very well.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, the core of the episode is very quickly through the nomads, because they've traveled the world. They know the stories and legends of all the different locations. And so to get to Amashu quickly, they have to go through the mountain, through the tunnel, basically, the secret tunnel. That's where the song comes from. Even the Fire Nation soldiers know the song, which is a funny little joke. But they quickly get trapped in here by the Fire Nation soldiers, and it's a bit of a struggle here. Appa is struggling being underground, and pretty quickly we get the kind of cave collapse kind of sequence. The group gets split up, and so it's like Appa, Aang, and Katara, and then Sokka is left with the nomads, basically. So he's in the worst situation imaginable, and it leaves Katara and Aang on their own to have their kind of more romantic kind of plot that we actually get. Interestingly, the kind of animal that sort of kicks things off is actually the kind of introduction of the wolf bats for the first time. That's what sort of scares kind of Appa to freak him out, to cause the kind of cave collapse. So we get wolf bats as well here as badger moles later on. So that's all kind of fine. And yeah, the setup here is just like two very opposing sides of the stories. They're ultimately both trying to get out, but you get the idea. Both Aang and Katara are going to let love kind of lead the way. The nomads are willing to, but Sokka isn't, and so it requires the badger moles to help that group get out. So most of the stuff happens in the second half of the episode, but do you have any thoughts on the kind of early part of the episode here, up to the kind of like setup of just like what we're doing here in the cave?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting that we do sort of see them sort of trying to work together in the beginning. Like we get sort of the idea of the map sort of layout and sort of, the conflict of why it's not sort of working here, and sort of them speculating on that right before we do get sort of the wolf bats, which is always cool because I forget that they're in this episode and that's what sort of where we've seen them from. But yeah, I think, it definitely just does a good job of, setting up our opposing sides here and how they're going to figure out how to get out of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. So, on the Sokka side of the episode, effectively he's just dealing with the sort of quote-unquote idiocy of the nomads, while he's trying to do things very scientifically here by mapping it out. They do realize that at some point that the tunnels are changing here, so immediately some kind of earthbending suggestions here. But eventually they end up running into badger moles, and they are pretty terrifying underground. They're huge animals. Sokka is in quite a bit of danger here, until while he's crawling away from them, he hits one of the kind of guitars, basically, the musical instruments of the group, and they seem to like the noise, because of course they're blind, they can't see, but they like the sound. And so Sokka is forced to start his own song, and the nomads kind of join in immediately. So that's a very kind of fun thing of just like forcing Sokka to join in on the kind of silly, over the top songs, and basically this makes them friends with the Badgermoles, and their side of the story is basically done with the idea that Sokka becomes friends with Badgermoles, and the Badgermoles get them out of the caves because they can earthbend, because they're, as we learn on the other side of the episode, they are the original earthbenders, the earthbending animals. And especially with the Badgermoles, I always like that it's so clear, probably more than a lot of the other animals, that it's not just that they're strong animals and they like crush earth. They full on, they are earthbenders here. They can do techniques, and have the sort of like actual kind of telekinetic earthbending kind of powers that we know of. So really cool stuff here. The main thing obviously is just, Sokka's frustration. We get the whole slapping his forehead joke. But it's, I think, all about just the unique introduction of a very memorable animal, the Badgermoles. But what are your thoughts on the Sokka and the Nomad side of the episode?
Yeah, I would agree that it is definitely a unique and a very, I guess, sort of memorable part of the episode in general, or just, Avatar lore in general, that, the Badger Moles are, sort of the original Earthbenders, and we can see how their techniques work and understand how they're, able to, navigate the world here. We don't, fortunately, we don't get to see the direct way that we see, Sokka and his music and the nomads sort of like directing the Badger Moles, but you get, a good enough idea, and then, I guess later on you get sort of a repeat performance of this sort of thing with a different character as well. So it's cool to see that this sort of, idea of how they interact with the world, how, people understand this, plays out in sort of the long run, all the way from this sort of starting point here, which I think is really nice.
Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the episode, Aang, Katara, and Appa eventually find their way to the tomb of Oma and Shu, the two lovers of legend. And so through Katara reading out what's written on the tomb, we get the sort of backstory of Omashu, effectively. And so it is basically Avatar's version of Romeo and Juliet, where Oma is the woman, Shu is the man. They're from opposing kind of villages either side of this mountain that they're in right now. Those two villages are enemies, but the two of them fell in love, and they met secretly in the mountain to kind of meet up. But they could only do this because they learned earthbending from the Badgermoles. This is how they were able to create like the tunnels initially, so no one could ever find them, and the whole kind of love lights the way kind of plot point comes up. But we get the kind of tragic aspect here where Shu dies in the war, and Oma, in a rage, uses her incredible earthbending power to stop the war. But she doesn't kill everyone, she instead unites the villages, and they form the city of Omashu as a monument to their love, because Omashu is literally the two lovers' names added together. So that is the story here. Note how it is told as a legend. It's just written on their tomb, so written after their deaths. And obviously it creates like a little bit of an issue with kind of more recent information, where they do pretty directly say they learned earthbending from the Badgermoles, they became the first earthbenders. And so a lot of people do use this to be like, beginnings like retconned, or like made a continuity error with what it did with the kind of actual reality of this, which is just that you're actually meant to just view this as they're the first humans to learn like the true style of earthbending from the Badgermoles, not that these are literally the first ever two humans to ever utilize the power of earthbending ever. Which it's a slight retcon, but because it is told as a legend here and not like super accurately, the visuals that we see when the story is told is not like direct animation flashbacks. It's told through like art pictures basically. So we don't even actually have like a proper like character design necessarily for Oma and Shu because of the art style that it's told in. It's also sort of unclear like exactly when in the timeline we're talking about here with these characters. based on beginnings, we assume it's like late Wan era or something like that, or maybe just after it, just before. It's not before Wan's era, but it's in or around that time for it to roughly make sense, which is interesting because it does mean it's actually one of the furthest back flashbacks that we've ever had. But what are your thoughts on the story of Oma and
Yeah, no, that is interesting to note there. I mean, the story itself, I think, I always thought was pretty cool. I mean, it's sort of your classic, star-crossed lovers type story, just set in the Avatar world with earthbending. So that aspect of it, I think, is pretty cool, and it definitely, it's a good sort of backstory lore for the city of Omashu, which of course is where they're trying to go to. So I always like that sort of aspect. The idea that it does or can sort of conflict with how things work later on. Yeah, I mean that could be an issue, but yeah, I think for me it always seemed more of like a legends sort of story told throughout the ages that isn't necessarily completely factually accurate. But I don't know, maybe that's something that if they really felt that needed, they could clear up later on. But the way that it works in this episode and the story overall, I think works pretty well for me.
And uh, if it is retconned, in my mind, it's actually retconned by Avatar itself rather than it being by Korra, because it's 313, so Firebending Masters, when we really heavily cover like original benders, where Toph explains that she also learned from badger moles. We obviously meet dragons directly in that episode, and Aang also mentioned, like the first time it's mentioned, that Sky Bison are the original airbenders. And so if you take the Oma and Shu story as being a literal, like full-on, like lore reveal of humans can just gain bending, like go from being a non-bender to a bender by just interacting with an animal, then the last airbender aspect of the show doesn't really mean anything, because Appa can just make any non-bender an airbender, which clearly is not meant to be the case, because of course, like with Toph, she is a bender already. It's just she learns martial arts, because like her backstory, they talk more about the philosophy, the approach, rather than the sort of like magic system that is like bending and how it works. It's the same when they in the book one finale talk about like the first people to learn waterbending learned it from the moon, and it's like they just watched the moon like move tides and they just gained an ability. There's a certain like I understand some people like the whole like, oh, people learn from nature and it activates something within them, but there's a certain like weird vagueness to that about like, well, then anyone can gain bending at like almost any time. I get they probably would never do that if that's the way it actually worked, but I think for it to make a little bit more sense, I like the way they more do bending, where it's like it's kind of passed down through generations, but there is a kind of somewhat random aspect to it, little bit of spirituality involved, but in terms of granting someone the ability, it has to come from a lion turtle, which are kept very like exclusive in most eras of Avatar. So that's I think the fundamental kind of problem with this. If you take this literally, it's like it's implying these animals all have a sort of magical ability to turn people into benders, when the approach is more about the martial art and like philosophy of the element, as shown like by the fact that when Aang and Zuko meet Ran and Shaw, they're shown something. They aren't the dragons don't do anything to Aang and Zuko to make them more powerful at firebending. It's just they show them the right way to firebend through a martial art form, and then through an application of firebending that is kind of beautiful in nature, not destructive. But what are your thoughts on that? Because at least to me, like I don't really remember a lot of like the general fandom reactions during ATLA, but I never remember, as someone who's always been into the lore, anyone particularly treating it as like fact and it being like this is how it works. The animals can just make people benders as being a thing. And I never remember having an issue when Beginnings said what it said about things. But what are your thoughts on the way it actually works?
Yeah, no, that is a good point, and I don't quite remember anyone really trying to break it down in that sort of way, at least from as much as I recall in terms of like, the sky bison or dragons or badger moles or like some idea of the moon, directly giving waterbenders powers. I think, we were always, wondering like what best animal from the water tribe would represent one that, would possibly be like a better, direct comparison that would actually teach like, the techniques of actual waterbending through like actual physical motion rather than just sort of general observation. But yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I think that never, I don't know, that once we found out sort of about the lion turtles, that sort of, made more sense because it didn't really seem, overall that like anyone could have, the ability of bending. It just, even before we knew about, how they would actually get the power directly, it didn't seem like it was something that you just could sort of like click and have on. Like there was some sort of exposure point, which now we know what that would actually be.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, that's sort of how I would always sort of break it down, at least in my head. But yeah.
Mm. And I still think it creates like a little bit of a mystery just surrounding the idea of like, okay, so they reveal that lion turtles have a power of an element within them, and this power of the element is the core kind of differentiator between the different kind of bending abilities. And like a bender has this is the thing that a non-bender doesn't have. But they never really explained, for instance, like, are lion turtles just born randomly with one of these, or did they get it from somewhere? And it kind of implies the question of
Hmm.
like, did they get that from the original bending animals, which is why they have it, or did the lion turtles give it to the bending animals? There's a bit of an interesting kind of one there of like who learned from who, because obviously I think everything points to the fact that like the lion turtles are like the kind of like first kind of physical beings, so like they would like predate dragons and sky bison and stuff like that. So, but it depends where they got the ability from. Do you have any thoughts on that? Where do you think lion turtles like power of the element, is that just inherent to them, or did they get it from the animals?
I don't know. That's a good point. I mean, I wouldn't think that they would get it from the animals, but I could see them getting it from like some sort of spirit animal or something like that, especially when, the worlds were more sort of one with each other and there wasn't as much of a division as we see later on until, the spirit portals were more back open again, of course. So I almost would kind of see it coming from that, especially if we're considering the lion turtles, one of the more, or the oldest sort of like, animal type creature in the Avatar world that we're seeing here. So I don't know. I would sort of think that they would predate, like badger moles or
Mm.
something like that. And, maybe the first ones that they deemed were worthy of the power were sort of these creatures and seeing how they would interact with the natural world around them. Because, chances are they're probably more worthy than most humans or most, people in that regard. So
Mm.
I don't know. I kind of would go with that flow, at least in my mind, at least.
Yeah, because I think that fits into the idea that like the elements as we know them, like, don't seem inherently tied to dragons. Like, fire, you wouldn't say has its origin in dragons, but its ability that dragons happen to have. So, like, the concept of like fire being an element has existed since, I guess, the beginning of time in the Avatar world. So there's sort of a sort of spiritual importance on like what the four elements actually are. It sort of gets into, I suppose, like, again, I think what the power of the element actually is at its core. It's probably one of those things that's like it's impossible to really explain what it is, because it has to just be some sort of a kind of energy kind of type thing that gets added into a human. Because we know like a normal human can't hold two powers of an element because they like explode basically. And it requires spirits to hold them. So I don't know. It just speaks to like, what is that energy? Is it literally that like if you are a bender, you have like almost like a fragment of like pure like primal fire within you? Like, how does the world work with regards to that? And it's very complicated like energy systems you get to talking about here. But because of that, I think it's another reason why like the animals more representing correct utilization of the power makes more sense than them being the source of the power itself. Their like movement with it and so on, it makes sense. Dancing dragon as the technique for firebending, of course, and the movement of, I guess, badger, sky bisons and stuff like that, representing air. It all works in that sense, I think. And then I suppose the final part of this episode is just, okay, we get this backstory. Love is brightest in the dark. The torch is beginning to kind of go down. So Katara suggests the idea of like, well, if that's how they found their way through this, by letting love lead the way, what if we kissed? And I think that's a very important one for the Katang relationship, is that Katara is the one to initiate the like kiss suggestion here. And of course, Aang ruins it by being really, really awkward. But when the torch actually goes out and they have no light at all, this is when they kind of come back around to it and they're like, well, last ditch thing to try and make something happen. We should do this. And there's discussion about like if they did or didn't kiss. I always leaned on the idea of like, I think they did, because otherwise it makes a few little subtle moments in the episode to kind of work in a kind of weird way, where like Aang is kind of like, can we talk about this? Or like he's about to say something and then Katara kind of rushes off towards the exit. And then at the very end of the episode, Katara blushes. And I don't think she would blush if they didn't actually kiss. Because, yes, you can say, like, I think people bring up, like, videos of, like, the voice actors talking about this, and I think they confirm that it did happen, but, like, that's a weird way to confirm something as such. I think the episode itself confirms it, and I think going forward, it feels like, you know, the fact that they did kiss here is why sort of future kind of kisses are quote unquote like on the table, because it already happened at this point, is kind of the way I kind of view it in the context of their relationship. But what are your thoughts on the Katang section of the episode?
Yeah, that's a good point there. I don't know. I guess I always sort of thought that they did too, just because that made future scenes and other episodes like that had more sort of awkwardness to them sort of work at least a little bit better in my mind. But I don't know. I think it could go either way, even if they, almost did but didn't fully hear. But I don't know. I think the fact that, like you said, that she is the first one to bring it up here just, sort of shows the progression of their, budding relationship here and how it can progress in the future, considering from before it was pretty much more one-sided on Aang's side here. So to see it balance out in this episode a bit, I think is, it's just a good idea that they have, for the overall progress of the relationship. So I thought that was nice that they have it here, and it just plays into the theme of the whole episode as well. So it works well as far as that on a couple different levels.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I suppose it does then mean that, like, okay, what was Aang actually about to talk to Katara about when they were still kind of like holding hands when the lights kind of come? And I get the impression he was going to maybe try and have the serious discussion of like, okay, so we did this now. Are we in a relationship? Are we a couple now? I think he was doing that. I think that's why they highlight that Katara just like runs off, where either she didn't view it as being as important necessarily of a thing, or as we kind of get from maybe later on in the series, like she's confused about like if when the timing of their relationship and stuff like that, because clearly even at this point, like the two do like super care about each other. And I don't know if you can particularly maybe pinpoint the exact moment for Aang where obviously by the time we get to episode 19 of this season, he knows he loves her. What other Katang episodes are there? You could say the Serpent's Pass to a certain, but I'm not sure. It feels like it's kind of like this one after this, because they kind of have a bit of a relationship moment here. This is probably what cements ultimately how he feels for the finale, and that's kind of I think a part of it as well. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about I suppose the relationship significance of this episode, given the kind of arc of Katang over the course of the series?
That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I guess overall in the series, because we have sort of, some of the more obvious points from Aang earlier on, and sort of the middle to the end of last season, and then going forward, it seems like they try to ramp it up a bit more until it gets sort of stalled out a bit. So I think this is a good, I don't almost want to say more of a really just a starting point for them actually sort of realizing, how much they actually care for each other. Because, like you said, we can see that, all of them have, relationship with each other, and they're all sort of, been around each other enough to have, something form already. But to have it go deeper to what it eventually becomes, I think this is probably more of like the initial sort of onset of that where we can really sort of, pinpoint it. I mean, the whole episode is like geared towards it. So it's a pretty, I don't know, important part as far as that goes.
Yeah, and then I think the thing with this relationship throughout the whole show is definitely that like their focus is like the mission, and this is the point that is made like in towards the end, like into the finale, especially in like Embryonal Players, and that scene is that the timing is not good to like start the relationship like right now when we're literally putting our lives on the line tomorrow, and this could affect things and so on. And I think it's probably, I think, from Katara, something she does maybe consider even back at this point, because like I said, like she kind of quickly runs out after the kind of quote unquote kiss scene happens, but then the kind of episode ends on like Aang kind of glances over at Katara, and then she glances off to the side and blushes. It's obviously, I think it kind of confirms the kiss, but it's also like, oh yeah, this is a development on both sides of the relationship episode as well. Because otherwise, with Katara, it's mainly what the fortune teller before this, so this was an important episode to have. But keep an eye on Katang as we go through the episodes. But I think that's pretty much everything. I love how blunt the sort of the nomads leaving is, where Aang's like, oh, do you want to travel with us? And they're like, nope, okay, bye. And they literally are just gone in like a second. Chong does say a more kind of meaningful goodbye to Sokka, and again the theme on that side of things is like focus more on the journey, less on the destination. But Sokka's just like, please just play the song and leave. And the whole forehead joke unravels itself right at the end. But any other final points on this episode that we might have kind of glossed over?
No, I think that's it for me.
So yeah, we'll swap straight away into Legend of Korra. So we've got a two-parter here, K203 and K204, Civil Wars Part 1 and Part 2. Lot to discuss in these ones, of course, because they're very interlinked episodes. Like, just for the sake of discussing it, we'll roughly try and consider the break point in each episode. But if we're going to reference stuff across episodes, pretty fine with how interlinked everything is. And there is a lot to talk about here, because we have to get into the big fandom discussion that comes up every so often, the is Aang a bad father discussion. But there's also like a million other things going on in book 2 at this point. And I'll make the point straight away that the episode's called Civil Wars, plural, not just Civil War, referencing the Water Tribe kind of conflict that happens. And I think that's very much more meant to be sort of like, view the episode as being read like family wars almost, because the episode really is about like conflict between brothers, sisters, big and small conflicts, because that's what we explore throughout the whole episode, like Unalaq and Tonraq, Unalaq and Korra. Senna's involved in this episode. Like, this is probably Senna's biggest involvement in like the whole show. We have Iki having issues with her siblings. Her relationship with her father is explored a little. Tenzin's relationship with his siblings, and of course, through that we get a bit about how Aang was as a parent also. And then throughout the rest of the book as well, we do tackle bits and pieces of this as well. But they cover all of these topics, and I think I'd almost make the point that, like, sure, the Water Tribe Civil War is a somewhat significant plot point, but as we've alluded to already, and I think we'll discuss in this episode, the Civil War, and especially because of how and why it happens and the manipulations behind it, it's not really necessarily full-on North versus South. This is a kind of subtext to other plots going on, and it's actually more about the interpersonal relationships more than anything. So I really like these episodes. I think a lot of people dismiss a lot of the early book 2 episodes before beginnings as being really, really weak, but at least in my opinion, like episode 1, 2, 3, 4, really, really strong, as we've discussed so far anyway. But Greg, what are your thoughts on the Civil Wars two-parter?
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I mean, I think, a lot of book two is kind of overlooked in general. And I think, even if you're not such a like strong fan of the book overall, I think these two parters together play a really good and interesting role in just developing, Korra's story and just, the story of the Water Tribe in general, from what we've seen them, in Aang's time to their sort of redevelopment in this one. I think that this one does a lot for it overall, especially just sort of, understanding how their cultures are working, the differences between them, and sort of, what, at least according to some people, is holding them back from the future and how they're sort of moving forward. Just the whole idea of just how they're playing in sort of the world, sort of sphere of things, I think is explored pretty well in this one. In addition to all of the little character bits that are going on that, is probably the actual real sort of civil wars of this actual episode, or these two parters.
Hmm. So I guess we'll start with just the Bolin and Eska stuff, just to get it out of the way. This is the smallest plot point across these episodes, and it's basically just highlighting the kind of weird, pseudo, kind of almost abusive relationship of like the way Eska and a little bit of Desna treat Bolin with their kind of weird romantic relationship they have going on, where she's calling him her boyfriend, and he's kind of like, yes, that's what initially it was, but he kind of wants out at this point because it's just getting kind of weird and awkward, and it's just this kind of discussion about like how does he break things off with Eska without kind of getting himself killed, because she's a powerful character here, both in terms of like her skills but also political power. Like, is Bolin in trouble here basically with Eska here, and so all of his kind attempts to break off the relationship just lead to her kind of becoming more and more committed, kind of to the point where they're engaged, and he has to run away from the engagement. And so basically the finale of these episodes is Eska charging after Bolin with sort of like enhanced emotional waterbending, and they barely get away on Varric's like escape yacht built for this exact purpose. It's it's not one of the stronger relationship plots over the course of the book. Like, in my mind, they somehow managed to rescue this in like the finale episodes, where they kind of reveal there's actually real feelings involved in this to a certain extent, but they both realize it's not going to work. Here, it's played a little bit too sort of like jokey, but also kind of a hint of seriousness. And I see what they're kind of trying to do in terms of like, oh, they bring Mako in to be like rip off the leech, kind of break up immediately. It's meant to be, I suppose, an allusion to what happens in like the next episode, I guess. But it's, to me, fine. I don't have too much of a problem with this. It's the lowest kind of plot point of these two episodes, but it's fine. Do you have any thoughts on the Bolin stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of the lowest plot point of this one, considering everything else that goes on. I think, it really is. I guess it's just their attempt to sort of balance out all of, sort of the seriousness that's going on between, the families and the relationship, and sort of the tribes and their relationship with each other. So, you know, even though it's not necessarily like a funny thing per se that Bowen's going through, and he, doesn't quite find it funny at all. To the viewer from the outside, you can see sort of the somewhat levity that, it's actually trying to bring to it, depending on, how funny you think that stuff actually is. So I think, depending on your taste, that could definitely be sort of a hit or miss type of thing. So some of it plays out well, some of it, maybe could be a bit sort of cringe, but I think, with it being, generally kind of minor and also sort of, interwoven with other things, it can work overall. And it does get, mentioned, like you say, a couple other times later on, and it does actually have a resolution of sort, which is, a bit better than some other plots that sort of just drift away.
And I do kind of like in sort of Bolin's kind of romantic arc that they kind of highlight the idea that he has a habit of being in relationships with like really like kind of unique individuals, like a princess here, movie star Ginger, the kind of pseudo setup for Bolin Korra in book one, that he goes for the notable characters. And so his kind of book three arc, where he's kind of like Opal isn't usually the type of girl I'm interested in, but that's actually the relationship that he needs because there's craziness too much in a lot of his other relationships. Something that's a little bit more normal is exactly what he needs. Is kind of a reasonable kind of arc with the way that they do it. But we'll over the course of the book cover the rest of the Escobolin. So after this, we sort of have to get into the more serious stuff. So I actually want to start towards the end of this arc, just so we can kind of get the theme across, and then we can go back and discuss a lot of the, because I think a lot of where the kind of almost misinterpretation of scenes comes from is the taking scenes, like, I wouldn't say out of context, but just on their own without the rest of the episode, so slightly out of context. But by the end of it, I think it's actually Iki who is the character who reveals what the theme of this whole episode, these two episodes, have been. When she has her conversation with her father after he finds her, she says, being part of a family is hard, but I guess the nice part about a family is they'll always be there for you. Even though Twinkle Starchild and Princess Rainbow fight, they still love each other. Tenzin notes the wise wisdom of young Iki here saying this. And I think that should be remembered as we talk about, like, all of these kind of familial relationships, ultimately. That we're talking about this dynamic of sometimes it could be hard being part of a family, but there's a care that is always there. So even though we're talking about, at times, very, very dramatic things, this is just like one of those lower moments kind of happening and in the process of happening. And in a way, the book is about the strong families getting through these, and then the one or two instances where, you know, say Unalaq doesn't actually care about his children, that one comes out as well. So I think that's important to keep in mind as a theme. But what are your thoughts? Did you latch on to that as also being kind of part of the theme of the episode, what Iki said?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's a good point to make in general, just because we can see how, Tenzin and his family and, some of the issues and, struggles that they've had that we'll discuss, sort of are, not perfect in a way, but, they are able to sort of come together at the end, and you can see, similarities with, Cora and her family. And then, you also get the complete opposite of that, where clearly things are not going to work out and there is some breakdown of communication and care there, and that sort of is leading to the conflict that we actually see in this episode, and that is actually just pushed on. So you can see sometimes especially when there are people that actually really care, there is some way of actually seeing a resolution there, and you can just sort of have some hope for the betterment. And sometimes things are just sort of out of hand, and there's might not be any way to go back from him.
Mm-hmm. So we'll go back earlier in these episodes. So where this all kicks off is we have Vacation Tenzin relaxing, his siblings come in, and apparently this reminds him of the vacations that they took together when Aang would bring them places. This is where the kind of a misremembering of things begins to come up, where Kaya and Bumi reveal that actually we weren't there on those vacations. Those were trips that Aang and Tenzin took together alone. That they begin to sort of tease Tenzin about this over the course of the whole episode, that it was Aang and his favorite son, the Airbender, and they just went on these trips together. And this begins to bring up a lot of kind of like these things from years and years ago. Again, keep in mind that like all three of these characters are over 50 years old in this episode. These are being brought up from years upon years ago, just kind of unresolved issues, but are they as big as would maybe make them out to be? And that's what we're kind of discussing here. And it's interesting how this is immediately followed up with Jinora and Milo arrive back, but no Iki, and they find out that, oh, Jinora and Milo were like teasing Iki and she ran away. And I think immediately they're framing it this way to highlight that the two groups of siblings, their conflict is meant to be viewed as being somewhat similar. Yes, the Jinora Milo Iki thing is a little more low key compared to what Tenzin and the others talk about, but going back to the kind of theming of the episode, it's just little things that happen between family members, between brothers and sisters, like all the time, whether it's teasing over something inane or a little bit more of a serious discussion about like who had time with who. They're the similar type of thing that they just need to communicate better to kind of get past these type of situations. So, what are your thoughts on the setup here on the vacation at the air temple?
Yeah, I think, there is a lot that you can see in the comparison there just because, of how they've all grown up and how they've sort of had to deal with, basically the world, sort of getting in the way or affecting their, personal family dynamic. I mean, there's, for maybe an average family, there wouldn't be a lot of that, but, considering, their father and, Tenzin and his sort of legacy, there's unfortunately a lot that plays into that and a lot of different things and directions that your time is being pulled in, which is something that, when you're sort of in the thick of it, which is sort of what Tenzin is sort of realizing throughout this episode, you can't quite, sort of grasp everything that's sort of going around with you. And, that's when you do need, your family or other people to sort of remind you of what's going on and sort of, maybe ground yourself a little bit more in the reality of things rather than thinking everything is, maybe 100% okay. So I think that's a really good way of sort of setting this up here and, being able to show it from the younger generation to the older generation.
Hmm. And yeah, where this goes from here is that it's decided that Tenzin and his brother and sister will go out to search for Iki together. But pretty much immediately they get into just sort of like kind of sniping at each other, and there's like a little bit of like these two will team up on the other one, and then it switches around as the discussion like progresses, and it's a little bit like, oh, like, like I said earlier, like all of these are over kind of 50 years old, and they're acting a little bit like kind of children a little bit at certain points. But again, it's addressing some of these kind of unresolved issues. And so Tenzin is kind of like, I think this is happening because I haven't spent enough time with them. And Kaya's like, yes, because you're exactly like Aang, because you focus so much on like duty above all else. Like you and him are exactly the same in that regard. And there's a little bit of a kind of sidebar on the whole idea of like Tenzin understanding that like the pressure Aang was under, but it does get a little bit kind of brushed aside as like a kind of valid topic that's being talked about here. They note, again, Aang was focusing on Tenzin more. That's why he brought him on those trips and not the others. And it all builds up to Kaya specifically. She seems to be quite emotional about this, noting that, you seem to view our childhood as being perfect. Well, it wasn't. And I think that the wording there is, I think, kind of important. And a lot of times when I do discuss this online, it's like I'll almost like point this out with the actual takeaway from this, which is like Kaya says there, their childhood was not perfect. That is not the same as saying that it was bad. In the same way, Aang's not a bad father. The presentation here is just that he wasn't perfect. It wasn't happy-go-lucky times at all times, because of stuff like you were alluding to a little bit earlier on about like this is like one of the first, like media era celebrity families type things going on. So there was some kind of unusual stuff going on because it was an era of change with Republic City coming into play and all this sort of stuff. Yes, they probably need to explore a little bit more about the family dynamic, but based on what's presented so far, it's like, okay, I think you can understand Aang making some of these decisions. Not great to a certain degree, because again, we don't have the full context, but that he's a terrible father, I never get where people come out of it with that at the end of it. But it's just one of those things where like you can't dismiss what Kaya and Bumi are saying, but I also don't think you need to blow it out of like proportion because of like the context of what's happening overall here. Everyone's criticizing everyone over everything in this episode, basically, because it's the kind of sibling banter that's happening here. But what are your thoughts on this kind of scene here as they're on the search for Iki?
Yeah, I think, it definitely does feel like it is one of those things that sort of gets sort of a little bit more blown out than it probably, deserves to be. Because I mean, just like we've seen in many of these episodes, and in just sort of an overall theme of Avatar, is that no one is exactly like perfect in this. Like everyone has to make decisions, and in this show specifically, our main characters, have to make even harder decisions that literally affect the world and how things happen going forward for future generations. So. Considering all that and the pressures that are involved with that, it's not surprising that things aren't, perfectly go lucky or anything like that. Like, there's ups and downs like there are in any sort of relationships, and the idea of it is, trying to find some sort of balance in that and trying to, sort of make the best of what you have. And, like it seems here, like, Tenzin isn't quite, aware of that, but he's coming to sort of realize this, and clearly this is something that has been building for a while. So the whole family as a whole, it it's not something that's been resolved, and that's something that the children of Aang are sort of figuring out all these years later, how this actually is working out here. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to consider, but it doesn't, I don't know, without knowing like sort of the full context, like you're saying, there's some key things there that might be missing for us to sort of automatically, condemn, Aang as like the worst, avatar ever, which is, something that Korra usually gets the title for.
Mm. Yeah, because like I suppose getting into it a little bit. So like the idea is that Aang took Tenzin on a couple of vacations where they went, I guess, to air temples and maybe a few other places along the way. And okay, Tenzin seems to remember them as vacations and the fun times, but like we also assume that's where a lot of the like you are the next leader of the air nomads kind of like discussion and details happened. And we know from like later episodes that like Kaya and Bumi do get bored by like air nomad philosophy and the discussion of this monk who like stayed still for like 3 whole days and stuff like that. Was there maybe just a sense of like, I assume you two wouldn't want to come along on this because like half of it's going to be just like meditating over like what it is to be an air nomad, and like airbender training sort of thing. And then like were the kids just the other two just like left behind to do nothing, or did Katara do something fun with them while this was happening? And then like ages of the characters as well, because there's at least I assume 10 years between Bumi and Tenzin. So if like Tenzin's like 8, that means like Bumi's like 18. Does he want to go on the vacation with his younger brother? Like, there are these type of things that happen as well, and it's like, you know, they remember now that they weren't on them, but do they remember why they weren't on the trips? Now they don't go into it, and I don't know how much you can speculate either way about it, but it's like there are those sort of complexities that do come into play as well, and they don't go super into it, and like the takeaway ends up being that like all of the kids should try and like carry on Aang's legacy, but there is one aspect of that Tenzin was the only one who could do it. So it does have to be acknowledged that that is an important thing for like the world going forward, to keep airbenders like alive. This information being like transferred was key to happen as well. But did you have any thoughts on that, about like how you might actually see some of the kind of details of like these situations surrounding these vacations going down?
Yeah, no, I suppose that is a good point as far as like, would they want to be involved, or did they, feel, maybe some sort of, resentment for being left out of these trips? I mean, they do mention, later on how, they all are his kids, they all, know some of the knowledge and stuff like that. But, as, Tenzin being the actual airbender, unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of that pressure, would fall directly on his shoulders, just in terms of, keeping the direct, teachings and skills and techniques, alive in that regard there. But yeah, no, that is something to sort of keep in mind in terms of just how, you know, how much around were they at that times when those things were happening on. I mean, trying to think to, any of those sort of other instances that we've seen of like sort of like young Tenzin, like in the comic, like were they around in that sort of instance then? Would they still be on Air Temple Island? It's some things to consider there for sure.
Mm. Yeah, so the next scene with them is that Boomy tells one of his tall tales. Tenzin and Kaya kind of grow a bit frustrated by this. And then we get into sort of like the other dynamic in the family that like Boomy is the only non-bender in the whole family of the siblings, but also including Katara and Aang in that as well. So you see that like they get a bit frustrated at his kind of like over eagerness to prove that he can do stuff even though he's a non-bender when in certain situations there are things that like he just can't do that a bender can. Um, Kaya gets called out a little bit here for kind of acting like their mother when she isn't. Similarly, like I think Kaya points out that like Tenzin, where were you when like dad died? Like I came back to be with mom when it happened, but then Tenzin is just like, yeah, but you came back after being like out traveling, finding yourself for years. So it's all these kind of like points that they quickly kind of brush past here with some of these characters that like we don't really know the details about, like just Kaya just being away from the whole family for like who knows how long, and like and especially when you get to like I think it's the finale in the Fog of Lost Souls, like we address the idea that like she seems to have this like fear almost of settling down, and I think she even says at some point in that while she's freaking out that like I don't have a family or something along those lines. So there was obviously a few years there where like she just completely removed herself from the family, which is an interesting kind of thing on
Mm.
the Kaya side of things. And then like Boomy being part of the military, you assume like okay, that's how he tried to prove himself as part of that. And in a way, like you can see that they all did in some way carry on the legacy, and that like Boomy being a key part high up in the United Forces is a perfectly valid position to be in as like the son of the Avatar, and he's a well respected commander. And then Kaya is, I suppose, after Katara, the best kind of healer in the world. We have to assume. Obviously, we don't know specifically like what her quote unquote like job in the world is, but like I'm guessing she continues that role on from like Katara. But it's interesting, you know, they all take a shot at each other in these scenes here, and like all the frustrations are coming out. But like I said, the resolution to some degree is like it's an angry resolution here, but like we should all be the ones to carry on Aang's legacy. But they do kind of like walk away from each other at this point. Like it does get a bit too much for all of them. But what are your thoughts on this scene, which I think is the final scene on part one of Civil Wars for this plot?
Yeah, yeah, I mean the legacy of Aang is, always something to be discussed and how, it passes through, his children. And, it definitely does seem like they've all, made some contributions to the world at large in some capacity from the abilities that, they gained from their parents here, which, is something that right now they're using as sort of like a conflict of contention, with each other here. They're not really seeing sort of like the positive side of things. So it's causing sort of issues right now, and it's going to, sort of cause them to sort of go on a little bit of a split here. But I think it's something where, they're still in the beginning stages of understanding how, how they have, each individually done their best to sort of uphold his
Mm.
legacy.
Yeah, and then I suppose going back to Kaya for a little bit, like you could also like interpret like her going away for a while as being like, well, there's Kaya being a little bit like nomadic, and like because like we know she like did say like talk to Aang about like her sexuality and stuff like that. I assume she probably talked to Aang about like I want to kind of travel the world and be a bit of a nomad and stuff like that. I assume stuff like that probably did happen. Like obviously the question's going to be like, are we for sure? Do we for sure know that that's the way it worked out or not? But I think it's interesting that they kind of have it like she was nomadic to a certain degree. But do you have any thoughts on that? Like the kind of almost mysterious like middle section of Kaya's life that we've had alluded to?
Yeah, no, I mean that sounds like it would be a great place for a story, right? Like just sort of like what everything's happened in the middle there. I mean, same thing for Boomy as well. Like, what did he actually do sort of in the forces as well? So yeah, I mean that does feel like, in a way that, she was probably more so like a air nomad than any of the other, her brothers, in that regard there, because she actually did go out and, experience the world, in some regard, and, what she sort of did, sort of her trying to find herself in that sort of regard, is almost just as, important as anything else.
Hmm. And then yeah, with Boomy, we're told at some point that like, what was it? Like, I don't know. It's not that he was kidnapped to join the United Forces, but like he was forced in some sort of a weird incident to do it. Like he just sort of like, almost like he was just put in a bag or something like that and just joined at some point. Like, you don't know if that's like a tall tale or what, but that's how that happened. Um, but anyway, this brings us into part two for this side of the plot. And yeah, pretty quickly we do have Tenzin does find Iki and she's hanging out with the baby Sky Bison, of course. And this is a very interesting scene because they have some nice kind of father-daughter time together. So this is like Tenzin resolving kind of that side of things, of like spending more time with his kids. So here's the sort of like check on the Iki side of things. We're going to get it in like the next episode with Milo, and we'll get it with like Janora as we go through the next couple of episodes as well. So that's good. But then interestingly, they talk about how like Iki wishes that Bumi and Kaya were there at their kind of like tea party. Whereas Tenzin's kind of like, no, 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 they'd mess things up. And so Iki talks about, the positives of Tenzin's brother and sister. But Tenzin is kind of like, oh, I want Milo and Janora to be here because of these positives. And Iki doesn't really agree with that because they're each annoyed at their own uh, like siblings, but they appreciate the others. It's an interesting one, and this is where the whole being part of a family is hard point comes up, and I think it's Iki saying this that kind of prompts the idea of like, yeah, we need to go back. Like, there's probably some apologies in order here. Like, we just need to actually get through this and actually talk about it. So this is probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole of these episodes. Like, one, it's cool to have all the baby bison just hanging out. It's a very fun Iki scene because you see like her personality, the kind of cutesy approach here, but also like Iki's surprisingly wise, and she's like she's got a good kind of mind for like talking and communicating to people, even if like it's in this scene with her father here. And that's always the aspect of Iki you kind of remember. But what are your thoughts on this Tenzin and Iki?
Yeah, no, she is really good at sort of talking things out, which, I mean, even when she's speaking, at like a thousand miles a minute, like she's communicating in some way that, if you can grasp what she's saying, it kind of works out perfectly well, as you can see from time to time here. But yeah, I think this is, it's a nice sort of heart to heart talk that they have here, having the sort of baby bison to sort of, bounce ideas off of, even if, they're not directly actually able to communicate. So no, I think this does a really good job of sort of, putting into place sort of the relationship dynamics, comparing, the two generations together, as we mentioned earlier, and sort of, how things are both good and bad, and you have to sort of, figure out how to work that together.
Hmm. And then the resolution here is they all come back. Milo and Janora are brought out to apologize to Iki, which they do. And literally, like, it's like pause, pause, and Iki's like, let's go play. And they're just off. Nothing has happened. And it sort of sets the example for the adults here to kind of do the same. So Tenzin goes over to Kaya and Bumi and also sort of apologizes for kind of having those rose-tinted kind of glasses on in the view of the past. They apologize for taking their frustrations out on him. And so they all reflect on the idea that like, okay, it's the kind of they come towards the middle of like Tenzin realizes, okay, it wasn't perfect, but Bumi and Kaya also kind of realize it maybe wasn't as bad as our frustrations make it out to be, because they pull out the old picture when they were younger, the family photo, and they all note that it's a happy family, that there were positive times, and in a way, over the course of this plot here, they lingered on some of the kind of more frustrating times when I think the idea here is that this photo is more representative of how things were most of the time. and that in the same way that the younger kids can get over this in seconds, this is the kind of resolution here to a certain that it doesn't go any further than this. We see sort of, I guess, progress with the idea that obviously Bumi next season becomes an airbender. Kaya sort of becomes involved in kind of running things on Air Temple Island and with everyone. So they do become more involved in sort of the new Air Nation, I guess, going forward. So that point of this kind of comes to a head where, like, you get the idea, like, Kaya had been maybe a bit separated from this for a while, but this is her deciding, I want to be part of this. And Bumi, I think we actually skipped past this scene. We did get the scene with Bumi speaking to the Aang statue, saying that he's tried his best to kind of continue on Aang's legacy, protect the world. He hopes he made him proud. Kaya says that he has. So Bumi gets his chance to sort of, like, in a way, you know, be closer to his father as we go forward. With, to me, like, there's never really another particularly negative note between these characters. Yes, there's a bit of a conflict between Bumi and Tenzin in 307, I think, original Airbenders, but that's more about, like, how Tenzin is as, like, a leader and a teacher than anything, rather than, like, their relationship as, like, brothers. So what are your thoughts on how they resolve these plots here with all the different groups of siblings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for the kids, it being sort of like this sort of quick sort of makeup, thing here, I think that works well because that, tends to happen a lot of time with kids in terms of their relationships and stuff like that. And then, with the adults here, them sort of having to sort of, take a step back, realize that, maybe everything wasn't perfect, but there were some times that were good, they did sort of, achieve some of their goals of, sort of upholding, Aang's sort of legacy, with Bumi in the armed forces and, Kaya with all of her journeys and, of course, Tenzin with everything that he's been doing and trying to continue doing. There's a lot to be sort of thankful for as well that, they might have missed and they're, sort of going back and forth with each other here. So I think for me, it works here. And, there are, there are other points later on where we see that things are sort of a lot better off. And of course, with like Bumi getting airbending, then that, changes the whole dynamic there as well. But it does seem like in the future that they all become sort of more involved together, just sort of together than sort of separate, which is what they were previously.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, like you bring in like other stuff, like in Turf Wars when Kaya explains to like Korra and Asami that, like, oh yeah, my father was like supportive when I discovered my sexuality. Like, that's a key point. Like, if Kaya had a true issue with Aang from like a young age about these trips that like he'd take Tenzin, would she feel comfortable like discussing with him something so like important? And then, yeah, like I was saying, the whole her kind of having a bit of a kind of nomad phase, an interesting one by itself. Even from Patterns in Time, the Cat-Owl's Cradle story with Bumi and Milo is showing like a bit of Bumi's growth from this episode, where he shows that even though they didn't particularly discuss it here, he does understand the pressure that like Aang was under, and like by the end of that, he understands why Aang went to this island to kind of find himself again. And so him bringing Milo there because Tenzin couldn't is him trying to, in a way, like I suppose, do something that wasn't able to be maybe done for him when he was younger to help Milo. So I think the thing here is just that, like, yes, in terms of content going forward, I think everyone would appreciate a few more kind of like positive leaning scenes to maybe sort of like balance out the kind of discussion here, which leans a little towards kind of negativity. But I think, like I said earlier on, people lean towards the idea that not perfect means bad, when it just means like somewhere in the middle. And that can still even mean like, 8, 9 out of 10. Like, it can still be like mostly good, even if it was kind of negative the way it was kind of brought up here. So again, it is sort of confusing that like people can apparently watch this episode, see the resolution with the picture, know all this context from the characters and still be like, I can't believe Korra presents Aang as a bad father. So I don't know. I think there are some times where you just have to be like, can we just like completely like no sell the next time this comes up and just not make it a discussion anymore? But that's that topic. But there's a lot more to discuss here in these episodes. So I suppose we have to get into the Korra side of the episode now. So this is where there's a lot of plot points happening here. So at the start straight away, I think there are some very interesting things where Unalaq explains that, like, okay, I know you're concerned about the troops being here in the south, but they're here to secure and protect the portal that we just opened, because you'll need to open the one in the north as well. And once you do, we can truly unite the tribes, because then we'll be able to travel between both tribe seconds. So I almost forgot that this was something that they mentioned, because we haven't seen like the spirit portals used in this way yet, even in like more modern Korra, where like, oh yeah, this technically unites both tribes, because both portals are open now where we are currently in Korra. You can technically go into one, just run across the Tree of Time area into the other portal, and you're in the other tribe. I'm guessing there's still security around the portals while they figure out like spirit world kind of safety kind of concerns. But it was just an interesting kind of like world building thing they brought up here, because obviously this isn't particularly Unalaq's goal, but it's a positive goal to present to Korra his kind of moment that he talks at the start of the episodes about uniting the tribes, but he doesn't particularly care about it outside of the portals. But do you have any thoughts on this kind of opening scene here with some interesting spirit world discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, if there ever could be a time, when you would really think that that was really his sort of like, goals for protecting and sort of uniting, just, knowing what he actually does in the end and his, his end goals and everything like that. Like, it seems like it's a good thing, but like, would that really work out well in the end? And, was there a time when, the portals were open and that could be really seen as like a positive thing and they really helped out each other like that way? Like, is that how they originally like split from each other to begin with? I don't know. It's an interesting idea. And, it's his, current justification in the episode, at least as far as, getting it across to Korra. But, it doesn't really, you see that fall apart pretty quickly. So I don't really, know how much stock you can really put into that, even though that's his sort of like, initial idea here.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about Unalaq in this episode. Like, I think in the first two episodes, you've seen him in like full control, getting everything he wants, while also, I suppose, roughly serving the perspective of like helping Korra actually be a better avatar. But more and more as you go through these two episodes, you see it's sort of beginning to sort of fall out of his control, that he does enough to prevent Korra from turning on him over the troops are now here situation. And even as we'll get further into the episode, even up until like the trial, just after the trial stuff, he does like just enough to keep her on side, but then it just falls apart enough to where I kind of like the idea he's been super manipulative, but then it gets to a point where it's just like there's kind of nothing I can do from here, which we'll see at the end of the episode 4. But from here we actually switch and we have a southern meeting, so the other side of this plot. Varric is here, Tonrock is here, and so a lot of the kind of high up southern people are here. They're having the meeting, yes, in Korra's parents' house. And what's basically happening here is that Tonrock is being somewhat reasonable in the sense that, like, okay, we don't like this, we'll probably want to do something to stop this. But it's actually Varric who's the one properly stoking the anger to turn this into like a civil war, in that like at the end of this scene he's like, we need to prepare for war. It wasn't Tonrock doing that, even though Tonrock ultimately like agrees with the idea of like, I don't think we should just like let this occupation effectively happen here. But he also doesn't go to any sort of extreme just yet. And this obviously, adds to the whole thing of like Korra has seen him not like disagree with this, so it kind of leads to her suspicions. It's an interesting scene because you see Unalaq, you see Tonrock like trying to be better with Korra, but Korra is still like annoyed at him from all the lies from the previous episodes. So it's a fascinating scene that like you almost forget that like, oh yeah, Varric is like a key player in all of this. Like the reveal that he's the villain is actually the more kind of like secret villain plot. Like a lot of people point out that like I can't believe they were trying to like tease the idea that Unalaq is a secret villain, and it's kind of like, when was that ever a plot point? It's been very clear. It's Varric who's actually the one who you're like, you really need to keep your eye on. But what are your thoughts on the Southern meeting?
Yeah, you really do need to keep your eye on him. He's always been like instigating things, even when he doesn't seem like he's trying to necessarily be like, the secondary bad guy or a secondary evil person. He's always like trying to meddle in things, which is just sort of his business side of things. So I guess it depends on sort of how much you view sort of like his business leanings as as far as being more sort of like nefarious compared to sort of like other characters who are we're just considering them just sort of like straight up evil. But yeah, no, the meeting itself, I mean, it does seem like it's not it's not going to go that sort of far, although he does sort of give that idea of that we're really going to have to sort of prepare for some sort of war and action later on at the end of it. But Rock is definitely, he wants to work things out with his brother. At least, he wants the Avatar to do it, since, obviously they're not on the sort of talking terms that would help in any sort of regard there. But it's really, they're really sort of, disgruntled and, not understanding of why this sort of, occupying force is here, as we see in the scenes coming up.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's important to realize here that like both sides of this kind of conflict, it's not really about the legacy issues between the North and the South, about basically why like there are two separate tribes and why the relationships are not perfect and why one's not independent. It's one side is basically like a war profiteering person trying to get the South involved in the fight, and then the other side is just like a spiritual character just protecting the two portals and is like basically just trying to get his brother out of the way. The actual North versus South conflict and tensions kind of just feels like it just happens because a conflict is happening. That there are, I think I've said this before, but I think there are other eras where you could probably better explore North versus South. And probably you need to go back to founding of the Southern Water Tribe to full backstory to properly explore this topic, because it's not really about this, which is why like I never fully really agree with people that think that the plot of book 2 should have been just more about North versus South conflict, just because I don't think at its core there's really in this era that much of a conflict between North and South, because it was actually positive in the ATLA era, and the only issue in this era is Unalaq as leader of both tribes, trying to execute his plan. It kind of makes people remember like kind of northern overreach basically. But what are your thoughts on that, about like this whole kind of civil war plot that happens here, but it's really just like a kind of undercurrent for like the motivations of like these other two characters, Varric and Unalaq, doing other things?
Yeah. I mean, there definitely is some there if they really want to explore in that regard, because we know that there is a history there. But up until this point, as far as we can tell, they're trying to sort of make amends for whatever that original split really was. I think if there was more sort of like a history here of sort of like the original reason between the split of the North and the South tribes, then that would probably play more into the fact that would be more what this episode should be more geared towards. But, as we've been mentioning, it definitely seems like the civils is more around, sort of the people and their ideas, and sort of how that's sort of butting up against each other, and how that's sort of, pushing these nations, or the North and the South specifically, at odds with each other. Whereas the people that are sort of like like the army people and everything like that, like the Water Tribe members, they're not really, they don't understand, or it's just not in their idea of what the overall scope of things actually are, which makes sense. Like, why would, any individual person know that, what, his actual big plans are for the spirit portals and everything like that. So it's definitely something that could be explored, if they really sort of geared the episode more towards that, which, I don't know, maybe that might make it more interesting for some people. But I think, for what they're trying to go for here in terms of like, pushing the story forward with Korra and the spirits and everything like that, they went the right route as far as I think so.
Hmm. So yeah, Tonraq asks Korra to go speak to Unalaq on behalf of the people. She does that, and he just notes that, like, well, I'm allowed to do this. I'm the chief of the South as well. Like, I don't know what the problem is. But Korra fears that a civil war might break out. And Unalaq is kind of interesting here because he's like, that would be terrible because that would like impact the spirits. That conflict would turn spirits dark. It would basically lead to humans versus spirits eventually, and that could be terrible. Um, and he really stresses that she must remain neutral in this conflict, but that he does have faith in her. And it's really around this time I think you start to note that like there's a slight little bit of kind of desperation here where it's like, okay, I get sort of stressing being neutral here. That's like a decent point, but it is very much serving his plan at this point. And then adding the "oh, I still have faith in you" is an extra bit on top of that. And immediately after this, Korra goes outside, stops a fight from breaking out between like soldiers and basically some kind of kids from the south that were kind of throwing snowballs at, and the South views Korra just stopping a fight from breaking out as being her taking the side of the North, and obviously this frustrates her. Tonraq then comes out and he calms things down because, of course, the South view him as being their leader, but this doesn't help his relationship with Korra because he's sort of like stepped over her to stop a conflict that she, to a degree, didn't fully get a chance to actually kind of de-escalate herself. But you kind of wonder, like, if he didn't intervene, like, would she have been able to stop it or not? But it is an interesting one, like putting Korra in this position, building up to like, should she be neutral in this or not? She doesn't know the full situation just yet. It's pretty interesting. But what are your thoughts on this dynamic here between Korra and Unalaq, and then her attempting to be neutral afterward?
Yeah, I mean, neutrality is a very hard thing to do, and depending on what you're actually doing with your, I guess, neutralness, it can be viewed from either end of the spectrum really here. So for trying to stop a fight can easily be seen as going either way here, which is sort of how the Southerners are actually viewing this, and it's actually her father that's actually the one to sort of appease this conflict here. And yeah, I do wonder if she would actually be able to sort of like put this sort of conflict to a halt without having to sort of get physical in any sort of regard here, which, considering her track record, that's usually what she defaults to in general here. But yeah, it definitely, definitely just shows you, just sort of the rising tensions here and sort of, the manipulation that's going on behind here that, even Core herself isn't quite aware enough at this point.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose it does speak to the fact that I think Unalaq does seem to be like not like political like at all. That he has the troops here to obviously protect the portals, but I don't really know if he really has that much of an opinion on like if the two tribes necessarily go to war. Now ultimately, like, he supports Vaatu, so he likes chaos. Ultimately, that's something he actually wants. So the thing that he's talking about, we should avoid at all costs. I guess he wouldn't actually mind because it helps spirits go dark. Um, but it is interesting that very little of what he attempts to do here is like avoid like a civil war potentially getting in the way of protecting the portals. He just is like, if it happens, it happens, because he's more focused on spiritual stuff than political stuff. He just seems to be like, I'm the chief of both tribes, so we'll just do it here. And I'm not sure if it's just that like we're meant to view it as like he's spiritual above political, or if he's
Mhm.
like bad politically and he just doesn't consider it. Do you have any thoughts on his kind of political views on things, Unalaq, versus what his actual plan is?
Yeah, yeah, no, that is interesting. Like, could he be like a decent politician in terms of like, leading, the war, the North and the South here? Like, is he aware of this actually happening, or is he just so blinded by his spiritual goals that he doesn't like it's just like a footnote to him in the grander scheme of things? I mean, it does kind of feel like he's more of like a grand scheme type of person, but he does. I mean, I wonder if his idea, earlier stating that, the conflict between the North and South will be horrible, and then the other nations would be involved, and then of course we're fighting the spirits. Like, is he just seeing it, for the fact that the spirits will become involved and that we'll be fighting them? But like you're saying, considering that he is, ultimately on the side of chaos, like how much does that really even play into his overall scheme of things? I don't know. I almost want to say like he just sort of, he's just sort of masking sort of what he really feels is going to happen. Like, I don't think as long as he can, get to the point where he can actually have the portals open and, access to Vatu, of course, he almost doesn't really care what actually happens. He just doesn't want things to get in the way of him, which I think is probably more of his stance than anything else,
Mm.
really.
And then I suppose referencing book three, like, are we meant to assume that, like, say, Unalaq would view ultimately world leaders' politics in the same way Zahir does, or is the whole Zahir anti-world leader thing Zahir as the leader of the Red Lotus philosophy?
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's hmm. I wonder. Yeah, I almost say that he's probably wouldn't go as far as that route. Like he's just more, I don't know, more on the idea of the spirits and how they're going to be involved in the world and sort
Mm.
of changing the landscape of things. Like not even sort of considering, I guess, sort of leaders in that sort of way, because it doesn't really feel like he's, at least as far as we can tell, which is it's kind of hard, right? That he's really considering them in that sort of, I guess, play of things of like the say like the reshaping the world for the next 10,000 years of darkness or however it's going to actually be shaped up,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, like yeah, it probably is just a case where he's considering that, like, I want to get to a situation where, like, the spirits are dominant, like, across the world. So where the politics between the water tribes doesn't matter, because politics in general won't matter when Vatu is free and chaos is spread around the world. But we will move on to another very, very, very interesting scene. Korra talks to Senna. So we finally have a Korra Senna conversation here. That's really, really, really interesting. She reveals to her mother that she's found out about all the lies about, why her avatar training went the way it did. She found out about her father's past, his banishment, and we get to, like, her mother kind of revealing that, like, oh, all we wanted was for you to have a normal childhood. Korra, very importantly, responds with that she never wanted a normal childhood. She always wanted to be the Avatar. Once she found out she was the Avatar, and that the people around her are holding her back from being the Avatar. We do get into an interesting thing here about, like, you know, Senna can obviously see that Korra wants to resolve this, but it's kind of pointing out that, like, I don't think you can resolve this because they don't know the kind of truth behind why the two sides are really fighting here, but that if it is about North versus South, this goes back so far. Can it be resolved with just one person? But there is a little bit of a sense that, like, it is kind of Senna almost. Are you holding Korra back in having this discussion with her here? Have you fully accepted it yourself? Type situation. But we get some of the details here. Senna's like, Varric is plotting rebellion. Senna doesn't really know if Tonrock is kind of fully involved or not in this, but Korra leaves just knowing that she has to be play a role in what's, like, about to happen in all of this. So I really, really like this scene. I think it's super important for Korra to just say out loud that I've always wanted to be the Avatar and have the full Avatar experience. I just want to be allowed to be the Avatar. And I think that's a lot of the point of these early episodes is that, yeah, like, Tonrock always stepping in front of her, Tenzin kind of speaking for her, even to a certain extent, aspects of this scene with Senna is kind of like proving the kind of point here of just, like, let me be the Avatar. And people around her are holding her back. Now, to be fair, Korra does have a ways to go to be the Avatar she needs to be, but it's 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 been restrictive so far with her, and I think that's the main point. That's why there is so much frustration with Korra with everything that's happening here, and it just builds and builds and builds to basically next episode. But what are your thoughts on this scene with Korra and her mother?
Yeah, I think this is a really good scene. It's a nice sort of heartfelt scene between the mother and daughter that, we don't really get a lot of, throughout the whole season. So, when we actually do get to see one of these, and especially at this point in time, is pretty meaningful. And you do get sort of the other side of this, of, the parents and sort of, their original sort of ideas and sort of how, they had to adapt and change to, what their daughter was, to become. So it is something to see, to hear both sides of the argument here. And, we know that, Korra has always been like all about the Avatar, like, from her initial appearance and I'm the Avatar, deal with it. Like, clearly that's what she's been about. But, the parents and everything that they've had to go through, they've tried to do, the best that they have here. So it's just, another instance of showing here that, no one is perfect. Even parents are trying to do, the best that they can do with the resources that they have here. And, sometimes, the younger generation doesn't quite understand that, or it has to be sort of something that's sort of understood over time here. So it's a nice talk here. And yeah, it does sort of end up with sort of the idea that, Korra is, as the Avatar, is just she's involved in things. Like if it's a small thing or a large thing, if it has something to do with sort of like the grander scheme of the world, where I would say that, this is definitely something that, she would have to be involved with to some degree. Maybe she can't be neutral, maybe she can be neutral, but as the Avatar, even an Avatar in training or a half-baked Avatar, is something that she's gonna have to sort of, figure out how to deal with, which is, it's interesting just to see her, compared to Aang, who didn't have any sort of, parental support, how, Avatar with parents, is, has to be involved with, these sort of conflicts, and they're not necessarily like the nicest things to be involved with. So it's definitely a very sort of deep and meaningful part, and sort of the start of things to
Hmm.
come.
We then immediately cut to Korra going to speak to Unalaq, but she finds a kidnapping in process. The Southerners have kidnapped Unalaq, and she sees a masked kind of like big man, so she thinks it's her father kind of leading this kidnapping attempt. Pretty cool action scene where like Korra mostly does like hand to hand kind of combat and no bending really, so she doesn't like injure people here to sort of take them down because obviously they're her fellow kind of tribe people from her tribe. Um, and she eventually, tracks down the leader, uses some bending to stop the snowmobile from getting away, takes off the mask, and it's revealed to not be Tonrock. And immediately there's a big sense of like guilt. Like Korra, there's a lot of emotion in Korra because she was convinced that this was her father, but it's not. Um, and it's actually revealed by the guy that Tonrock purposefully didn't take part in this at all, and they almost view him as a traitor because he didn't. Um, so very very interesting scene there. Um, it immediately followed by like Unalaq, of course, wants to just kind of lock them all away, but Korra would like a fair trial, and again, this is kind of more Unalaq manipulating Korra with the whole idea of I'll make an extreme point, Korra will talk me down, I'll accept it, and she'll stay on my side type situation. So I don't know. Again, I think this is another point of a lot of people criticized these episodes, the Studio Pierrot episodes, for their animation, but that was a pretty nicely done, like kind of more hand to hand combat, kind of acrobatics focused fight scene that was somewhat complicated in nature. Uh, I I still maintain I think the animation is good. It's maybe not as good as Studio Mir, but it's uh, completely up to standard in my opinion. But what were your thoughts on this action set piece?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fun one. I think it's, it shows, Korra doing a bit different type of style of fighting that we've normally, seen her do with sort of the bending and stuff, because like you said, she's not trying to hurt her fellow tribesmen. So I think it's pretty cool to see her actually do these other techniques. It just shows you her physicality that she has that isn't limited to just her sort of bending prowess. So it's always, neat to see this here. And added to the fact that, she thinks that it's her actual father that she's sort of chasing here, it sort of adds a bit more sort of emphasis to this actual battle here than we, might otherwise have. So no, I thought it was really cool. I really like how this one turns out, and sort of how there's still all this sort of back and forth going on, and sort of things that, of course, still doesn't quite understand in terms of the overall
Hmm.
goals.
The final scene of Civil Wars Part 1 is that Korra does go back to speak to her parents. So it's Tonrock and Senna in emotional moment. She walks in the door. They're like surprised to see her. Pause, pause, pause. Korra bursts into tears. She's just happy to see that they're both there. She apologizes for basically doubting her father. But Tonrock also apologizes to her, saying that like he's proud of her, that when he saw the Southern Lights, he realized like, I should never have held you back. So it's him admitting that he was doing that. Senna at this point does say like that when the two of them found each other, they just wanted a simple life after kind of what had happened in Tonrock's past. But when Korra turned out to be the Avatar, it did change things for them, and it kind of pointing out that at least from her perspective, it's like she has had maybe a hard time with the idea that literally this kind of 180 from what they wanted to what they actually have with their daughter, and that's maybe on her side of things, like her needing to accept that. And right as we get this amazing kind of reunion scene between Korra and her parents, Unalaq walks in and has Tonrock and Senna arrested for being part of the kidnapping assassination plot against him. So, how is he going to keep Korra on side through this is going to be a big challenge for him. But again, I love this scene here. Um, it always gets brought up with Korra, of course, that it was actually a very good exploration. An Avatar actually having parents, because for the most part, we don't really get to see that. Like even in like all of the avatars that we've focused on, it's never really been much of a plot point. Like I don't think we don't know anything about Roku's parents. Kyoshi's parents again were gone by the time we properly like got into her as a character, but there's at least something a little bit about them. Of course, nothing with Aang, nothing with Yang Chen necessarily, or really Karuk. So it speaks to the idea that like this is really like the first time seeing this, and just even these small scenes with
Hmm.
Senna, I think work really well to just highlight that. Yeah, that's a complicated situation for a parent to be in. That you know your child is sort of like destined to be almost involved in everything and always be put in danger to some extent, will always be journeying around the place. You won't have as much time with them, even if all you want is just a quiet life. And that's an interesting topic by itself, but really, really good scene. But what are your thoughts on this one, Cora and both of her parents?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's nice that they have this sort of resolution. I think that was done pretty well here, and just sort of, accepting or, starting to accept the fact of, Korra and just everything that has gone through and will go through in the future as an avatar. And then, yeah, the whole idea that, they're both going to be brought in, I think is always sort of like one of those shocker standout moments for the end of this, two-parter, which you're really glad that they do, go straight into the next part after this.
Hmm. So yeah, from there we basically get the kind of trial scene. There is a fun little Varric scene where like Varric is obviously hiding because at this point Unalaq also wants to hunt down Varric because he does know Varric is kind of key behind them. And also from a more actually personal to Unalaq perspective, I think he's very aware that Varric, as the big businessman who's not spiritual like at all, is someone he would also like to have out of the way. That was, I think, in Rebel Spirits they kind of directly alluded to that. Like when Unalaq gives his big kind of speech that no one's expecting, the camera cuts straight away to Varric, who's not really paying attention. Um, so that's interesting.
Hmm.
But yeah, the judge, we get a little bit of questioning here, but it's all basically just to highlight that this line of questioning only leads in one direction, which is that the meeting where effectively this kind of kidnapping plot kind of sort of came about from happened in Korra's parents' house. They were both there. Um, this is how it happened. Senna is viewed to be innocent, but everyone else, including Tonrock, is sentenced to death. And Korra immediately is just like, if you take their lives, I'll take yours. And it's like, whoa. But Unalaq intervenes and is like, he gets it changed to being life imprisonment instead of death. And it feels like, oh, we've saved things for now, but like this was pretty harsh, and you can really look back and see that, like, oh yeah, this is sort of definitely manipulated by Unalaq to make him come across as being reasonable in the middle of quite crazy events that are happening. Any thoughts on the kind of trial scene here?
Yeah, I mean, it's all a setup. Everyone's trying to set up each other in this one here, so it's kind of funny, like you're saying, looking back on it, how sort of like manipulated the whole thing actually is, and such a farce of the moment is. But Korra's very heated. I mean, she's always sort of a heated type character, and she goes to the extreme here, and even how she sort of resolutes this sort of incident here is also on sort of the extreme end here. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting just to see how they do this sort of court trial thing in sort of the southern border tribe, and I guess presumably this is how they would do it in the north as well. So that is interesting to see how maybe if this wasn't so sort of rigged to begin with, how this might actually work towards the betterment of things.
And it is interesting here, like, in the grand scheme of this, that they never really get into the details of like, wait, isn't it confirmed that like Tonrock wasn't actually there, but he's still sentenced with the rest of them who actually kidnapped Unalaq? And it's like, that's where you see that like the judge asked questions down a specific avenue and didn't give Korra a chance to reply with information that could like help. But yeah, they go back home, and there's another nice Korra Senna moment. Like Senna has basically just kind of lost her husband in this moment, and Korra just sees her mother like lost in tears, and it's kind of like Senna says like, I feel so helpless, but Korra's not helpless. She can do something and rushes into action, and this is where we get she confronts the judge, like kind of crashes his car, and it is quite kind of extreme what happens here, and it's lucky that it works out the way it does, because you wonder like what would have happened if the judge was actually just being kind of fair but like harsh. But it is revealed by the judge under threat of Naga that Unalaq has basically been behind everything here. The trial was rigged. He was just trying to manipulate everyone. That's why he was being somewhat reasonable in some of these scenes to keep Korra on side. And that also Unalaq was responsible for Tonrock's banishment all those years ago. And sort of off screen, it's told to Korra, and Korra relays this to us later, which is that he hired the barbarians to attack, and understanding his brother well enough, he knew that having the barbarians attack in a specific way would prompt a specific attack on the spirit forest by his brother. So that's how that all came about. So that's a weird one where it's still like, Tonrock was still anti-spiritual in that it's just, it was a manipulated kind of scene. He still did technically make the wrong kind of tactical choice ultimately, but it was a scene that happened only because of Unalaq's approach, and this was how he got power, the north and the south. So big reveals here from a guy who's been on Unalaq's books for quite a while, many years they've worked together. So what are your thoughts on this scene, Korra threatening the judge with Naga?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you could definitely see how this could be viewed as like really, really like bad and really extreme, which, there's a good chance, it's not like Korra would have actually gone through with anything in this sort of regard here, but, the judge doesn't know that, and I guess, to some degree, we're supposed to believe that that might not happen as well. But, she's visibly upset, visibly, angry at everything that's sort of going down here, and, gets more information than she, immediately, sort of thought that she would actually get. So she, uncovers a lot more that we might have thought of. So this was, considering everything that's going down, I think this is a really cool one to sort of get sort of the the full scope of the manipulations that's been going on for years at this point here. I mean, the fact that the judge says that he's been, on the books for like such a long period of time and knows all this history, it almost makes you sort of wonder, what else does he know about what's going on here? So no, I thought this was sort of extreme, but a good one in the way of just sort of getting all this info dump, I guess, in a timely manner.
So, she finds out that the Tonrock's in jail, so she goes to basically break him out. She realizes that that's what she has to do here. Unalaq confronts her though. She's with the rest of the teammates here, and is like, Tonrock is on a ship to the north, and he'll serve his sentence there. And it's at this point is where Unalaq realizes that he can't keep the manipulation up. So this is where like the full sort of mask sort of slips. Yeah, I'm the kind of villain in all of this. He doesn't fully, like, he doesn't say what his plan is necessarily, but he's kind of like, okay, I don't feel the need to kind of, manage you in the way I have been up to now. And there's some pretty interesting stuff that happens here. Like, now that Korra realizes like he's been behind, like his jealousy of his brother has been behind like so much of what's happened, you get a very interesting line like, I bet it just kills you to learn he was the Avatar's father. No wonder you kept trying to take me away from him. And I kind of wonder about that because they don't allude to this that much more, but as someone who is super spiritual, as part of the Red Lotus and their whole plan to kind of get the Avatar on their side, this must have been quite a hit for him to find out that his brother, the non-spiritual guy, is the father of the Avatar. And then I wonder how much of the whole you kept trying to take me away from him is just referring to like the events of book 2, or does she now reflect on like maybe previous meetings with her uncle where stuff starts to kind of jump into position for her? Because obviously she doesn't know and doesn't find out until next book about the whole kidnapping when she was younger, Red Lotus situation. Because again, even no one even really knows about Unalaq's involvement in that except like the Red Lotus members. But what are your thoughts on that line in particular? I think it's quite an important one that Korra, I think, truthfully latched onto that and kind of has picked that out as like an important thing about Unalaq. But what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of feels like she's flipping the script now from what she, previously thought of him, like, really supporting her and, her newfound spirituality and sort of, having all this confidence in her in terms of like what she can do, not just for the spirits, but just for the world at large, being the Avatar. She's completely just saying that, like, everything that you've been saying is just not was a lie. It was just, another one of the manipulations to get her sort of basically trying to put a wedge between her and her family, essentially at this point, which I don't know, part of that's just sort of, what he was actually trying to do to sort of just keep her on the side and, use her for his own good. And, it's just sort of what she's sort of, how hurt she feels at this point in time here. I wonder if it is something that she's able to reflect on from like earlier on in like her childhood or something like that. Like I definitely could see it being like a point of contention, in terms of like, him having the brother having, the Avatar versus him, and like not having her. But I don't know. I wonder, how much that played into things, and the kidnapping that we know was supposed to go on before but didn't actually go through. There's just a lot to go through there. I don't know. I can't see a lot of that being there unless there's like, he tried to get in on like her sort of like Avatar training from the beginning. Like maybe, he was trying to compete with, Qatar for like, the waterbending master or something like that. Like that would be an interesting, thing if that was actually a point that happened later or previously in the past. So that would be cool if that was sort of something that was explored. But I don't know. I take it more as for sort of the current times here and sort of, everything that he's sort of brought up that, Korra is sort of reflecting on, even if, he still did have, some valid points of, her being hidden away from the world at large, compared to, sort of a more traditional Avatar sort of upbringing. But, to Korra at this point in time, it just seems like everything is sort of going against what she's been taught recently.
Yeah, and that is the point, especially like looking ahead to like the finale where she'll make a decision to some degree based on what she did learn from Unalaq. You think, does she just throw it all away here? And it seems like for the most part she kind of does, but then comes to kind of reflect on, oh no, wait, actually he was onto something even if he took it too far. But she does say in the scene that like she will not help Unalaq with his plan anymore, because he obviously said earlier on that like I need you to open the northern portal. Oh yeah, just randomly in the kind of middle of all of that happening, um, he does say, yeah, he doesn't need her anymore, even though he said it before. Now, the truth of this only comes out like a few episodes from now, when it's revealed that this is a complete lie. He just assumes that he will somehow find a way to resolve this without her being involved in any of this at all. He really doesn't have a solution to this here. So I think it's really interesting to look back at this scene and see that, oh, this is a full on lie. He's just hoping to be like, oh yeah, you're not important anymore, when he actually truly does need her. But what are your thoughts on that? This is the moment where he's truly lost control, but he actually, there's no confidence, I suppose, in what he's saying here, because it doesn't work what he actually plans.
Yeah, I think he's definitely sort of like overstepping sort of the realities of his abilities and what he can actually, bring to fruition, considering what he currently knows at least. So yeah, he definitely, I think, this might be one of those incidents where he's just sort of, he's annoyed, he's angry at the situation, that he's sort of lost control of the Avatar, and his manipulations here have completely sort of fallen apart, and there's really no sort of going back for it. I mean, I wonder if, he was able to somehow hold, Korra in this sort of situation here, like get her under control or whatever. Would this, would he still bring her along in terms of, towards the spirit portal in order to sort of manipulate her or use her in some sort of way to actually get his means in the end, which of course we know what happens later on, but that might have been something that he might have thought he could have been using in the background, regardless of him saying that, oh no, I don't need you anymore, since we do find out that he actually does.
Mm-hmm. There's a small fight here that is pretty much just like knock Unalaq away a little bit to escape. But it is sort of a little bit of an indicator that like he's strong enough to like hold his own against like Korra and Mako and so on, like a few characters here, which we'll see later on, like is a real highlight of just how skilled Unalaq is as a bender, which is one of those things where I think more and more people come around to realizing that like actually, yeah, Unalaq's actually a super powerful bender, not just from a spiritual point of view, but just in general, even if there's still not a lot of appreciation for his character. So even though this is just a really small scene, I do appreciate them highlighting that it took a bit of effort to even just like knock him back a little, even if it's just a small fight in a corridor. But as we get towards the end of the episode here, it's just basically they get on Varric's yacht, they use the plane to get Korra in close to the blockade. She does some Avatar state stuff here to get through the blockade. They break everyone out, and yeah, the reveal is like the tribes are now at war with one another. Korra is told by her father then to go to Republic City and get Raiko's help, as we basically get the idea that Tonraq has, I suppose, in this scene, more so than he kind of has been before, is now viewed as being sort of the chief of the South in the conflict that we have going on at this point. And that's pretty much kind of where we ended here, with just the idea that the South doesn't have the firepower to like win against the North, but they can hopefully hold out until maybe they get the help from Raiko and the United Forces. That's the mission for like the next episode. Korra is going to have to be a bit of a diplomat going forward here, and we'll see how that happens in the next episode. But what are your thoughts on the final kind of scene here of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's going to happen going forward in order for them to really sort of win this, what they're considering a civil war here, which is really just sort of more of a power play, as they're sort of understanding here compared to where things actually have been. But yeah, I mean, the idea that they're going to be able to sort of like hold out until the forces come. I mean, no, I wonder how much of that is just sort of like, talk to talk, or, they really believe they can do, considering what does eventually sort of happen later on. But, I think, it's interesting to see, Korra being thrust into yet another role that, she might not have thought of, the Avatar actually having to really, do that much. But, it definitely is something that the Avatar has to do quite a lot. And, that's, I guess that almost is probably more the sort of like actual, like, neutral-ish part that they might actually do, when they're trying to not be directly involved in things. But here she has to be.
So yeah, that is the Civil Wars two-parter. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about in these ones. So much kind of going on, and to some extent, like this plot kind of does still continue, like especially on like the Tenzin side of things. We'll have the kind of the Milo stuff with Tenzin in the next episode. Basically, I suppose you'd say episode 9. The guide is where the Janora kind of stuff comes back into play. And we get sort of like the rest of that development, because from where we started in episode 1, we've now basically resolved Korra's conflict with her father, but we haven't really got around to, like, say, Korra's issue with Tenzin, which that's another thing that still has to happen, and we'll get to that, of course. That more or less takes until the finale to kind of get to, for the most part. So lots of great stuff here. But yeah, like I the more and more I rewatch these episodes, the more and more I like them. It's very hard almost at times to not look at the general fandom reception to episodes like these ones and how they're kind of used, I suppose, and not kind of feel that like, oh yeah, these are probably some of the weaker episodes of Korra. But actually, no. So far, there's no, like, I think, standout weakness with the start of book 2. I do think as we move forward, like, the next 2 episodes, I think, are maybe where some of the problems come into book 2. But it is 2 out of 14 episodes, in my mind, that are slightly weaker in this book, and it's not the Civil Wars two-parter. But what are your final thoughts on these two-parter?
Yeah, no, I think this two-parter, as well as like most of the two-parters that we've ever come across, have always been pretty strong, because they have their own sort of plot line and through line that, really sort of pushes the whole narrative forward. And this one has, a lot of moving pieces in it between the different characters here. Even sort of the B side plot of things has a lot going on, and all of it still continues through, like you said. Like, it doesn't actually sort of like automatically resolve things. It just sort of pushes things forward in almost sort of like accelerated way.
And I understand what some people say is that, like, when we leave the South here, we don't really return to this conflict apart from like a couple of scenes, like right towards the end of the book. But like we were discussing, I don't think a lot of the conflicts that are happening here are super representative of like true North versus South conflict. And probably the best evidence of that is that how this is actually resolved at the end of the book is that with just new leadership in the North, the South is just given their independence. And as far as we're aware, there isn't a particular conflict between North and South. Now, maybe there is some, like, deep down kind of legacy conflict from, just the differences between the tribes that is still there for some people. But I never felt that the Korra era was the era to explore that in. But, yeah, next group of episodes that we're going to be reviewing is... obviously, for the Korra side of things, we're actually going to do another 2 episodes. So we're going to be doing K205, Peacekeepers, and K206, which is it's not the Stakeout, that's book 3. The Sting. That's what it's called, the Sting. So we'll be doing those 2 episodes, and then on the Avatar side of things, we'll be swapping over to Return to Omashu. So some pretty entertaining episodes here, where I think we'll be dealing with potentially some of the weaker book 2 episodes, but even saying that they're weaker, I still think there is some good stuff in them. Like I think we get most of kind of Mako's plot in these two episodes. Some of the Varric stuff comes out here, so we can get into that. Potentially some of the weaknesses with maybe the Asami stuff in this we'll get into. And then Return to Omashu is, of course, a pretty notable avatar. But any quick thoughts on the next group of episodes to review?
Yeah, I mean, the Masha one, I really remember liking that one, if I recall correctly, just because of seeing where things have come and how they do change and how it, it's not exactly sort of like the best case scenario for the episode, but it does, help Aang to sort of think about things. And yeah, for the other ones, yeah, I think they're interesting because they do sort of, go around just sort of core, sort of trying to work with people in different ways that we haven't really seen it. And, I think, despite, things with the episode with Mako, it's interesting just to see him on his own and how he tries to do things.
So, yeah, other than that, that has been episode 258 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.